What if the fate of nations rested not on the clash of swords, but on the tedious minutiae of grain regulation? What if hidden within the dry, dusty pages of the 1724 Grain Act lies a secret history of power, intrigue, and agricultural subsidies? Tonight, we won't be chasing those shadowy conspiracies. No, tonight we will find our peace in the slow, deliberate, almost excruciatingly detailed process of drafting legislation, 18th century British legislation, to be precise. We'll explore the commas, the subclauses, the agonizingly specific definitions of barley and oats contained within the magnificent monotony of the 1724 Grain Act. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Snooze Stories for more wonderfully boring bedtime content. Now dim the lights. Let us journey back to a time of quill pens, powdered wigs, and debates soporific enough to tranquilize a parliament. A time when the most thrilling drama revolved around the price of wheat. The year is 1724, and the 1724 Grain Act is about to be born. The year is 1724, and the 1724 Grain Act is about to be born. Imagine, if you will, the rolling hills of the British countryside. Not the vibrant greens of a summer's day, mind you, but the muted browns and ochres of early spring. Picture the fields, freshly plowed, the rich, dark earth turned over in anticipation of the planting season. The air, still crisp with the lingering winter chill, carries the scent of damp soil and the faint, earthy aroma of manure. Yes, manure. A vital component of 18th century agriculture, essential for enriching the soil and ensuring a bountiful harvest. We'll delve deeper into the intricacies of fertilizer later, perhaps in part 14 or 15, but for now, let's simply acknowledge its presence. The agricultural landscape of 18th century Britain was a patchwork of small farms, interspersed with larger estates owned by the landed gentry. These estates, often encompassing hundreds, even thousands of acres, employed a significant portion of the rural population. Imagine the rhythmic thud of horses' hooves pulling heavy plows, the squeak of wooden wheels on rutted cart tracks, the gentle clinking of harnesses. The days were long, the labor arduous, and the rewards, well, let's just say that subsistence farming was the reality for many. The primary crops cultivated during this period were, of course, grains. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye formed the backbone of the British diet. Wheat, the most prized of these grains, was primarily used for bread, the staple food of the time. Imagine the coarse texture of a loaf of 18th century bread, the dense crumb, the slightly sour tang. Not the fluffy, pre-sliced wonders we find in supermarkets today. No, this was bread born of hard labor, bread that sustained a nation. Barley, a hardier grain than wheat, found its way into both bread making and brewing. Ale, a ubiquitous beverage in 18th century Britain, provided much-needed calories and a mild escape from the drudgery of daily life. Imagine the warm, yeasty aroma of a tankard of ale, the frothy head, the slightly bitter taste, a welcome respite after a long day in the fields. Oats, primarily used as animal fodder, also played a crucial role in sustaining the agricultural economy. Horses, oxen, and other draft animals relied on oats for their energy, enabling them to perform the heavy labor required for plowing, harrowing, and transporting goods. Imagine the gentle rustling of oats in the wind, the pale golden stalks swaying in unison, a silent symphony of sustenance. Rye, often considered a less desirable grain than wheat, was nonetheless a vital food source, particularly in poorer regions. Rye bread, darker and denser than wheat bread, was a staple of the rural diet. Imagine the earthy aroma of rye bread, the slightly chewy texture, the subtle hint of bitterness. A humble food, but one that provided sustenance to generations. The methods employed in cultivating these grains were, by modern standards, rudimentary. Plows, often made of wood with iron tips, were pulled by teams of oxen or horses. Sowing was done by hand, the seeds scattered across the freshly plowed field with a practiced sweep of the arm. Harvesting, a labor-intensive process, involved sickles and scythes, the rhythmic swishing of blades through the ripened stalks. Imagine the golden waves of grain falling before the harvesters, the air thick with the dust of chaff and the sweet scent of ripe grain. The weather, always a fickle mistress, played a crucial role in the success or failure of the harvest. Too much rain, and the crops could rot in the fields. Too little, and they could wither and die. A late frost could decimate a season's worth of labor, while a prolonged heat wave could scorch the earth and leave the fields barren. The anxieties surrounding the harvest were palpable, a constant undercurrent of worry in the lives of rural communities. The 1724 Grain Act, the very subject of our current exploration, was born out of this complex agricultural landscape. It was an attempt, however flawed, to regulate the volatile grain market, to provide some measure of stability in a world often at the mercy of the elements. We will delve deeper into the specifics of this act in subsequent installments, exploring its clauses and subclauses with painstaking detail. But for now, let the image of those 18th century fields settle in your mind. The slow, rhythmic cycle of plowing, sowing, and harvesting, the quiet hum of rural life. Let the gentle monotony of this agricultural tableau lull you into a state of peaceful drowsiness, a world governed by the slow, deliberate rhythm of the seasons. And it was this very rhythm, this dependence on the vagaries of nature, that led to the anxieties and uncertainties surrounding the grain trade. These anxieties, these uncertainties, were not new to the 18th century. They were, in fact, a recurring theme throughout British history, a constant murmur beneath the surface of daily life. And so, before we delve into the specifics of the 1724 Grain Act, we must first understand the context in which it arose, the whispers of concern that gradually coalesced into a call for action. Imagine the dimly lit chambers of Parliament, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the oak-paneled walls. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax and pipe tobacco, the murmur of voices a constant drone. Within these hollowed halls, committees were formed, tasked with the arduous task of examining the state of the grain trade. These committees, composed of gentlemen of varying degrees of expertise and interest, would pore over reports, hear testimonies, and engage in lengthy debates. Imagine the rustle of parchment, the scratch of quill pens on paper, the monotonous drone of voices reciting figures and statistics. These were not glamorous proceedings. There were no dramatic pronouncements, no impassioned speeches, just the slow, methodical grind of bureaucratic machinery. One such committee, formed in the years leading up to the 1724 Act, produced a report of truly impressive tedium. Its pages, filled with meticulously recorded details of grain prices, import and export figures, and regional variations in supply and demand, paint a picture of a market in constant flux. Imagine the endless columns of figures, the precise notations of bushels and pecks, the painstakingly detailed accounts of grain shipments arriving from distant ports. The sheer volume of data, the sheer density of the prose, is enough to induce a state of profound drowsiness. This report, and others like it, meticulously documented the fluctuations in grain prices, the periodic shortages that led to hardship and unrest, and the attempts, often unsuccessful, to stabilize the market. Imagine the dry, factual language employed in these reports, the absence of any emotional inflection, the sheer monotony of the prose. The committee members tasked with sifting through this mountain of data would have spent countless hours poring over these documents, their eyes glazing over as they attempted to decipher the complex interplay of factors affecting the grain trade. One particular section of the report, devoted to the intricacies of grain storage, delves into the various methods employed to preserve grain from spoilage. Imagine the detailed descriptions of granaries, the precise specifications of ventilation systems, the meticulous accounts of the different types of pests that threatened the stored grain. We learn of weevils, of rats and mice, of the constant battle against dampness and decay. The level of detail is astonishing in its dullness. Another section, dedicated to the regulation of grain exports, explores the various laws and regulations that had been implemented over the years in an attempt to control the flow of grain out of the country. Imagine the lengthy discussions of tariffs and quotas, the intricate details of licensing procedures, the endless debates over the merits of free trade versus protectionism, The language is dense, the jargon impenetrable, the overall effect soporific. The committee's report, in its painstaking thoroughness, lays bare the complexities of the grain trade, the challenges of balancing supply and demand, the difficulties of regulating a market subject to the whims of nature. It reveals the anxieties that plagued policymakers, the concerns that prompted them to seek solutions, the slow, gradual process of formulating policies aimed at stabilizing the volatile grain market. The report itself, however, is a testament to the tedious nature of bureaucratic proceedings. Its pages, filled with dry facts and figures, offer little in the way of excitement or drama. Instead, they offer a glimpse into the slow, deliberate rhythm of government, the painstaking process of gathering information, analyzing data, and formulating policy. A process that, in its very monotony, can induce a state of deep relaxation, a gentle descent into slumber. The discussions within these parliamentary committees, documented in these tedious reports, laid the groundwork for the 1724 Grain Act. They were the whispers in the dimly lit chambers, the rustling of parchment in the quiet hours, the seeds of an idea slowly germinating in the fertile ground of bureaucratic process. And as we delve deeper into the specifics of the act itself, we will see how these early discussions, these nascent proposals, shaped the final legislation. But for now, let the image of these dimly lit chambers, the droning voices, the rustling parchment, lull you into a state of peaceful tranquility, a gentle drift into sleep. And from these seeds, the 1724 Grain Act slowly took root. But before we examine the specific clauses and subclauses of this fascinatingly unremarkable piece of legislation, we must first understand the political terrain upon which it sprouted. Imagine the House of Commons, a crowded, bustling space filled with the murmur of voices, the shuffling of feet, the occasional cough or sneeze echoing through the high-ceilinged chamber. Here, amidst the throng of Whig gentlemen, we find the key players in our story, men whose names, for the most part, have faded into the mists of time. Their motivations, often obscured by political maneuvering and personal ambition, were rarely as straightforward as they appeared on the surface. Consider, for instance, Sir Gilbert Heathcote, a prominent Whig politician and a leading figure in the East India Company. Imagine his powdered wig, meticulously styled, his fine silk waistcoat, the glint of gold on his watch chain. Heathcote, a staunch advocate for free trade, saw the fluctuating grain prices as a threat to the stability of the mercantile system. His speeches, documented in the dry, impersonal language of parliamentary records, reveal a concern for the impact of grain shortages on the broader economy. Imagine the rustle of his papers as he addressed the House, the measured cadence of his voice, the occasional clinking of coins in his pocket. His arguments, though couched in the language of economic theory, were likely influenced by his own vested interests in maintaining a stable trading environment. This is a speech he delivered in the brass ring on the bar after inviting a fellow speaker to speak first, having asked him. Then there was Sir John Barnard, a Tory MP representing the City of London. Picture him, a slightly more austere figure than Heathcote, his wig perhaps a touch less elaborate, his coat of a darker, more somber hue. Barnard, a staunch defender of the interests of London merchants, viewed the grain trade through a different lens. He believed that government intervention in the market was necessary to protect consumers from price gouging and ensure a steady supply of grain to the capital. Imagine him rising to speak, his voice a bit gruffer than Heathcote's, his gestures perhaps a touch more emphatic. His pronouncements, recorded in the same monotonous parliamentary records, reveal a preoccupation with the practical realities of feeding a large and growing urban population. These two men, Heathcote and Barnard, represent just a small fraction of the individuals involved in shaping the 1724 Grain Act. Their debates, their disagreements, their compromises are all documented in the voluminous records of parliamentary proceedings. Imagine the endless pages of transcribed speeches, the meticulous notations of votes taken, the detailed accounts of committee meetings. The sheer volume of material is frankly overwhelming. And within this vast sea of documentation, the motivations of individual actors often remain elusive. obscured by the dry, impersonal language of official record. Beyond the prominent figures like Heathcote and Barnard, there were countless other MPs, each with their own particular interests and agendas. Imagine the backbenchers, the lesser-known members of Parliament, their voices often drowned out by the more prominent speakers. Their contributions to the debate, though less well documented, were no less important in shaping the final legislation. Imagine them whispering amongst themselves, passing notes, occasionally rising to offer a brief comment or question. Their motivations, often rooted in local concerns or personal connections to the agricultural sector, added another layer of complexity to the already intricate tapestry of political maneuvering. And then there were the lobbyists, the representatives of various interest groups who worked behind the scenes to influence the legislative process. Imagine them, whispering in the corridors of power, buttonholing, MPs offering inducements, making threats. Their presence, though rarely acknowledged in official records, was a constant factor in the political landscape. Their motivations, often driven by financial gain or the protection of specific industries, added another dimension to the already convoluted process of policymaking. The political landscape of the time was a complex web of competing interests, shifting alliances, and hidden agendas. The 1724 Grain Act, a product of this intricate environment, emerged from a long and convoluted process of debate, compromise, and political maneuvering. Imagine the late-night meetings, the whispered conversations, the backroom deals. The final legislation, a document filled with dense legal language and intricate clauses, reflected the compromises made, the interests balanced, the battles won and lost. It was a testament to the messy, often frustrating, reality of political decision-making. And as we delve deeper into the specifics of the act itself, we will see how these political machinations, these hidden agendas, shaped the final legislation. But for now, let the image of these bustling chambers, the droning voices, the whispered conversations, lull you into a state of peaceful tranquility, a gentle drift into sleep. And so we arrive at the text itself. Imagine the parchment, thick and creamy, the ink a deep, rich brown, the quill scratching across the surface, leaving behind the indelible marks of legislation. The very first draft, now fragile with age, sits in the archives, a silent testament to the laborious process of lawmaking. The language, a dense thicket of legal jargon, designed more to obfuscate than to illuminate. Consider the opening lines, a veritable labyrinth of whereas and heretofore clauses, each one a carefully constructed legal hurdle designed to trip up the unwary reader. Imagine the clerks, hunched over their desks, meticulously copying out these convoluted phrases, their pens scratching across the parchment in a monotonous rhythm, a lullaby of legalistic precision. Clause 1, a sprawling behemoth of a sentence, deals with the definition of corn. Not just any corn, mind you, but corn fit for human consumption. Imagine the debates over the precise definition of fit, the arguments over the acceptable levels of weevil infestation, the discussions of the proper moisture content for optimal storage. The wording, painstakingly precise, leaves no room for ambiguity, no space for interpretation. Corn, the Act declares, shall be understood to mean, and then follows a litany of specific grains, each one carefully delineated, each one subject to its own set of regulations. Wheat, rye, barley, oats. Each variety is listed, its inclusion or exclusion debated and decided upon with the utmost seriousness. Imagine the rustling of papers as these lists were read aloud, the monotonous drone of the clerk's voice echoing through the chamber, a soporific recitation of agricultural commodities. Then comes the matter of measurement. Not bushels as one might expect, but quarters. And not just any quarters, but quarters according to the Winchester standard. Imagine the discussions surrounding the precise dimensions of the Winchester quarter, the debates over the acceptable margin of error in measurement, the arguments over the standardization of weights and measures across the kingdom. The very idea of a Winchester quarter conjures images of dusty old market towns, of bustling grain exchanges, of the clatter of scales and the shouts of traders haggling over prices. Imagine the sacks of grain being weighed, the meticulous recording of each transaction, the endless calculations involved in converting bushels to quarters and back again. Clause 2 delves into the intricacies of import and export duties. Here, the language becomes even more convoluted, a dense web of tariffs, quotas, and exemptions. Imagine the charts and tables used to illustrate these complex regulations, the endless rows and columns of figures, the mind-numbing calculations involved in determining the appropriate duties for each type of grain. The very words ad valorem, specific duty, drawback, are enough to induce a state of drowsy indifference. Imagine the clerks poring over these figures, their eyes glazing over, their minds slowly succumbing to the sheer tedium of the task. And then there are the exceptions. Oh, the exceptions. Each clause seems to be followed by a proviso, a caveat, an exception to the rule. These exceptions, often written in even more convoluted language than the original clauses, create a labyrinthine legal landscape, a maze of ifs, ands, and buts. Imagine the frustration of trying to navigate this legal thicket, the endless back and forth between clauses and exceptions, the sheer mental exhaustion induced by the effort to understand the intricacies of the Act. Clause 3 addresses the issue of price controls. Here, the Act attempts to regulate the price of grain, setting upper and lower limits to prevent both price gouging and market collapse. Imagine the debates over the appropriate price levels, the arguments over the impact of price controls on supply and demand, the discussions of the unintended consequences of government intervention in the market. The language used to describe these price controls is meticulously precise, each word carefully chosen to avoid ambiguity. Maximum price, minimum price, market equilibrium. These terms are defined and redefined, their meanings parsed and dissected with painstaking thoroughness. Imagine the endless meetings, the heated debates, the compromises reached and broken, all in the pursuit of the perfect balance between protecting consumers and ensuring a stable market. The very thought of it is tiring, isn't it? And on it goes, clause after clause, page after page, a relentless onslaught of legal jargon and technical terminology. The sheer volume of information, the intricate details, the endless qualifications and exceptions, it's enough to make one's head spin. Imagine the poor clerks, tasked with copying out these endless pages of text, their pens scratching across the parchment in a monotonous rhythm, a lullaby of legalistic precision. Their eyelids grow heavy, their heads begin to nod, and slowly, gently, they drift off to sleep, lulled into slumber by the sheer monotony of the task. And you, dear listener, can join them in their slumber. Let the words wash over you, let the jargon lull you into a state of peaceful tranquility, let the sheer boredom of it all carry you away to the land of dreams. Sleep, sleep, sleep. And so we arrive at the hallowed halls of the House of Commons, 1724. Imagine the scene. Gentlemen in powdered wigs, seated on plush velvet benches, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and pipe tobacco. The chamber itself, dimly lit by flickering candlelight, echoes with the murmur of hushed conversations. The speaker, perched upon his elevated chair, raps his gavel upon the wooden table, calling the House to order. A hush falls over the assembled members as the clerk, in a dry, monotonous voice, begins to read the proposed Grain Act. Imagine the rustling of papers, the creaking of chairs, the occasional cough or throat clearing punctuating the silence. The first murmurs of dissent arise not against the act itself, mind you, but regarding a procedural matter. Mr. Bartholomew Pruitt, member for somewhere unremarkable in Wiltshire, rises to his feet, a point of order on his lips. The candlelight glints off his spectacles as he adjusts them, a slow, deliberate movement. His voice, thin and reedy, cuts through the silence. He questions the placement of the comma in subsection 4, paragraph 2, line 7. It should, he insists, be after the word thereof, and not before. Imagine the ripple of whispers that spreads through the chamber, the rustling of papers as members consult their own copies of the proposed act, searching for the offending comma. Mr. Pruitt, his face flushed with the exertion of his argument, points to the relevant passage with a trembling finger, a small, insignificant mark on the page, yet capable of stirring such passionate debate. Sir Reginald Humphrey, a portly gentleman with a florid complexion and a booming voice, rises to counter Mr. Pruitt's objection. He argues, with a certain pompous air, that the placement of the comma is entirely correct and in accordance with established parliamentary procedure. He cites precedent after precedent, droning on about obscure parliamentary rulings from decades past. Imagine the monotonous rhythm of his voice, the hypnotic effect of his legalistic pronouncements, washing over the assembled members like a gentle wave. The candlelight flickers, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, a mesmerizing display of light and darkness. The debate drags on, each side entrenched in their position, the placement of a single comma becoming a matter of national importance. Other members chime in, their voices adding to the droning chorus of legalistic argument. Mr. Fitzwilliam, known for his pedantic attention to detail, produces a thick volume of parliamentary procedure, its pages brittle with age. He flips through the pages, his finger tracing the lines of text, searching for further evidence to support his argument. Imagine the rustling of the pages, the soft thud as the heavy book lands on the table, the hypnotic rhythm of his searching fingers. The air grows heavy with the weight of words, the chamber filled with the monotonous drone of legalistic debate. The candles burn low, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. Outside, the night is quiet, the only sound the occasional clip-clop of horses' hooves on the cobbled streets. Inside, the debate rages on. A battle of commas and semicolons, a war of words waged over the minutiae of legal language. Imagine the exhaustion creeping into the voices of the debaters, the drooping eyelids, the occasional stifled yawn. Finally, after what seems like an eternity, the speaker calls for a vote. The members, weary from the protracted debate, rise to their feet, their movements slow and deliberate. The tellers, their faces pale and drawn, begin the laborious process of counting the votes. The silence in the chamber is broken only by the rustling of papers and the occasional whispered comment. Imagine the slow, methodical counting of the votes, the monotonous recitation of the numbers, the final pronouncement of the result. The motion is carried, the comma remains in place, a small victory for Sir Reginald and his supporters. Mr. Pruitt, defeated but undeterred, sinks back into his seat, a sigh escaping his lips. The clerk, his voice dry and emotionless, continues reading the proposed act, moving on to the next clause, the next sentence, the next word. Imagine the endless stream of words, the intricate details, the convoluted language, washing over the assembled members like a soothing balm. Their eyelids grow heavy, their heads begin to nod, and slowly, gently, they drift off to sleep, lulled into slumber by the sheer monotony of it all. And you, dear listener, can join them in their slumber. Let the words wash over you, let the jargon lull you into a state of peaceful tranquility, let the sheer boredom of it all carry you away to the land of dreams. Sleep, sleep, sleep. The clerk, unfazed by the previous debate, continues, his voice a low hum in the dimly lit chamber. He proceeds to outline the proposed amendments to the initial draft of the 1724 Grain Act. Imagine the gentle scratching of his quill pen against the parchment, a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound. The First Amendment, a minor alteration to the wording of Section 3, subsection 1 regarding the permissible moisture content of imported barley, is read aloud. The suggested change, replacing the word damp with moist, is met with a brief silence. Lord Ashworth, a man known for his meticulous nature, raises a languid hand, inquiring as to the precise definition of moist in this context. Imagine the slight rustle of his silk waistcoat as he shifts in his seat, the faint clinking of the gold chain adorning his pocket watch. Sir Thomas Cartwright, a junior member of the committee, rises to offer an explanation, his voice hesitant and slightly trembling. He explains in painstaking detail the difference between damp, implying an excessive level of moisture, and moist, suggesting a more acceptable level of humidity. He refers to several agricultural treatises, quoting passages on the ideal moisture content for barley preservation. Imagine the rustling of pages as he flips through the thick volumes, the faint scent of aged paper filling the air. His explanation, though thorough, is delivered in a monotonous tone, the words blending together into a soothing drone. The debate on this amendment is brief, almost perfunctory. A few members murmur their agreement, while others simply nod their heads, their eyes already beginning to droop. The amendment is approved with a quiet murmur of assent, the clerk dutifully noting the change in the margins of the document. Imagine the scratching of his quill, the slow, deliberate movement of his hand across the parchment, the faint squeak of the inkwell as he dips his pen. The next amendment concerns the specific weight measurements used for calculating grain tariffs. The original draft specified the use of the Winchester bushel, a standard unit of measurement. However, an amendment proposes the use of the imperial bushel, a slightly larger unit. This seemingly minor change sparks a surprisingly lengthy discussion, primarily concerning the potential impact on revenue collection. Mr. Harrison, a member with a reputation for fiscal prudence, rises to express his concern that the larger unit of measurement could lead to a decrease in tax revenue. He presents a series of calculations, meticulously outlining the potential losses to the Treasury. Imagine the dry, monotonous recitation of numbers, the rustling of papers as he refers to his notes, the faint tapping of his finger against the table. Mr. Bradshaw, a proponent of the amendment, counters Mr. Harrison's arguments, claiming that the larger unit of measurement would simplify trade and encourage greater grain imports. He argues that the increased volume of trade would offset any potential loss in revenue per unit. He too presents a series of calculations, equally detailed and equally monotonous. Imagine the back and forth exchange of figures, the droning recitation of statistics, the hypnotic effect of the numbers washing over the assembled members. The debate drags on, each side presenting their arguments with painstaking detail. The candlelight flickers, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, a mesmerizing display of light and darkness. The air grows thick with the weight of numbers, the chamber filled with the monotonous drone of economic debate. The members, weary from the protracted discussion, shift in their seats, their eyelids growing heavy. Imagine the occasional stifled yawn, the rustling of clothing as they adjust their positions, the subtle signs of fatigue creeping in. Finally, after what seems like an eternity, the speaker calls for a vote. The members, their movements slow and deliberate, rise to their feet. The tellers begin the laborious process of counting the votes, their voices barely above a whisper. The silence in the chamber is broken only by the rustling of papers and the occasional muffled cough. Imagine the slow, methodical counting of the votes, the monotonous recitation of the numbers, the final pronouncement of the result. The amendment is narrowly defeated. The Winchester bushel remains the standard unit of measurement. Mr. Bradshaw, disappointed but resigned, sinks back into his seat, a sigh escaping his lips. The clerk, his voice dry and emotionless, continues reading the proposed amendments, moving on to the next clause, the next sentence, the next word. Imagine the endless stream of words, the intricate details, the convoluted language washing over the assembled members like a soothing balm. Their eyelids grow heavy, their heads begin to nod. Another amendment, relating to the permissible levels of ergot in imported rye, is brought forward. The debate on this matter is mercifully brief, the members seemingly eager to avoid another protracted discussion. The amendment is approved with a quiet murmur of assent, the clerk duly noting the change in the margins. Imagine the scratching of his quill against the parchment, the soft, almost inaudible scraping sound. The next clause deals with the transportation of grain by water. It specifies the types of vessels permitted to carry grain, outlining the required dimensions and construction materials. It delves into the minutiae of barge design, discussing the optimal length-to-width ratio for river transport, the advantages of oak over elm for hull construction, and the precise placement of reinforcing beams. Imagine the technical jargon, the dry recitation of specifications, the mind-numbing detail. Mr. Fitzwilliam, a member with a maritime background, rises to question the practicality of the specified dimensions. He argues that the required length of the vessels would make them difficult to maneuver in certain narrow waterways. He suggests an amendment to allow for slightly shorter barges, citing his own experience navigating the River Severn. Imagine his voice calm and measured, his words precise and technical. yet somehow still inducing drowsiness. Mr. Cavendish, another member with maritime interests, counters Mr. Fitzwilliam's argument, claiming that the shorter vessels would be less stable in rough waters. He presents a detailed analysis of the physics of buoyancy, explaining the relationship between vessel length and stability in choppy conditions. Imagine the complex diagrams he unfolds, the intricate lines and angles, the mesmerizing patterns. His explanation, though technically sound, is delivered in a monotonous tone, the words merging into a soothing drone. The debate on this amendment continues for some time, each side presenting their arguments with painstaking thoroughness. Imagine the back-and-forth exchange of technical details, the dry recitation of nautical terminology, the hypnotic effect of the discussion. The candlelight flickers, casting dancing shadows on the walls, a mesmerizing display of light and shade. The air in the chamber grows heavy with the weight of technical jargon, the monotonous drone of maritime debate filling the room. The members shift in their seats, their eyelids growing heavy, their minds beginning to wander. Imagine the occasional stifled yawn, the rustling of silk and wool, the subtle signs of fatigue creeping in. Finally, the speaker calls for a vote. The members, their movements slow and deliberate, rise to their feet. The tellers begin their count, their voices hushed and monotonous. Imagine the slow, methodical counting of the votes, the whispering of numbers, the quiet announcement of the result. The amendment is narrowly defeated. The original specifications for vessel dimensions remain unchanged. Mr. Fitzwilliam, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face, resumes his seat. The clerk, his voice dry and emotionless, continues reading the next clause, the next sentence, the next word. Imagine the endless stream of words, the intricate details of the Grain Act washing over the assembled members. This clause concerns the inspection process for imported grain. It details the procedures for examining grain shipments for quality and purity, outlining the acceptable levels of various impurities, such as chaff, stones, and insects. It specifies the qualifications and responsibilities of the inspectors, the methods they are to employ, and the penalties for failing to comply with the regulations. Imagine the detailed descriptions of inspection procedures, the meticulous enumeration of acceptable impurity levels, the dry recitation of bureaucratic protocols. Mr. Hargrave, a member with an agricultural background, rises to question the practicality of the proposed inspection methods. He argues that the requirement to inspect every sack of grain would be excessively time-consuming and costly. He suggests an amendment to allow for random sampling of grain shipments, arguing that this would be a more efficient and cost-effective approach. Imagine his voice, calm and reasoned, his words measured and deliberate. Mr. Bellingham, a staunch advocate for consumer protection, counters Mr. Hargrave's argument, claiming that random sampling would not be sufficient to guarantee the quality and purity of imported grain. He presents a series of hypothetical scenarios, outlining the potential risks to public health if contaminated grain were to enter the food supply. Imagine the graphic descriptions of foodborne illnesses, the detailed accounts of potential outbreaks, the alarming yet somehow soporific nature of his arguments. The debate on this amendment continues for some time, each side presenting their arguments with painstaking detail. The candlelight flickers, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, a mesmerizing display of light and darkness. The air grows heavy with the weight of arguments, the chamber filled with the monotonous drone of bureaucratic debate. The members, their weariness growing with each passing moment, shift in their seats, their eyelids becoming increasingly heavy. Imagine the occasional heavy sigh, the rustling of clothing, the subtle signs of fatigue taking hold. And so, the second reading of the Grain Act continues. Each clause, each sentence, each word, drawing the members of the House of Commons deeper into the realm of slumber. Finally, after what seemed an eternity of meticulous debate and painstaking scrutiny, the second reading of the Grain Act in the House of Commons concludes. The clerk, his voice a dry rustle of parchment and ink, announces the result of the vote. A majority, though not overwhelming, supports the bill's progression to the House of Lords. Imagine the subdued murmur that ripples through the chamber, a gentle wave of sound washing over the weary members. The candles, now burned low, cast long flickering shadows, creating an almost hypnotic dance of light and shade upon the paneled walls. The bill, bundled in its official wrappings, tied with a length of thick, dark ribbon, is dispatched to the upper chamber. Picture its journey, carried by a junior clerk, through the dimly lit corridors of Westminster, the soft thud of his footsteps echoing in the stillness. He arrives at the House of Lords, the grand chamber a stark contrast to the more utilitarian space of the Commons. Imagine the rich tapestries adorning the walls, the ornate carvings on the wooden furniture, the air of quiet dignity that pervades the room. The Grain Act is placed before the Lord Speaker, its arrival announced with a formal, almost ceremonial pronouncement. The Lords, fewer in number than their counterparts in the Commons, sit upon their plush red benches. Imagine their faces, etched with experience and wisdom, their expressions a mixture of polite interest and mild indifference. The Lord Chancellor, his voice a sonorous drone, begins the first reading of the bill. He reads the title, the long, formal title that enumerates the bill's purpose with painstaking precision. Imagine the slow, deliberate cadence of his voice, the words resonating in the hushed chamber. The first reading is a formality, a mere recitation of the bill's title and purpose. There is no debate, no discussion, only the rhythmic rise and fall of the Lord Chancellor's voice. The Lords listen, or appear to listen, their eyes half closed, their minds perhaps wandering to other matters. Imagine the gentle rustling of silk and velvet as they shift in their seats, the occasional soft cough echoing in the stillness. The date for the second reading is set, a week hence, giving the Lords time to peruse the bill's contents. Imagine the thick document, its pages filled with dense legal prose, being circulated amongst the members. Some, perhaps the more conscientious ones, take the time to study its provisions, their fingers tracing the lines of text, their brows furrowed in concentration. Others, perhaps more preoccupied with matters of state or personal affairs, merely glance at the document, their eyes skimming over the pages, their minds elsewhere. The week passes slowly, filled with the usual business of the House of Lords. Debates on matters of foreign policy, discussions of trade and commerce, the occasional petition from a disgruntled citizen. The Grain Act, for the most part, remains unnoticed, a silent presence amidst the more pressing concerns of the realm. Imagine the dusty shelves of the Lord's library, the bill resting amongst other documents, waiting its turn for further consideration. Finally, the day of the second reading arrives. The Lords assemble in the chamber, the air thick with anticipation or perhaps just the usual afternoon drowsiness. The Lord Chancellor, his voice regaining its familiar drone, begins to read the bill, clause by clause, sentence by sentence, word by word. Imagine slow, methodical unfolding of the bill's provisions, the intricate details of grain regulation being laid bare before the assembled Lords. The debate, when it finally begins, is subdued, lacking the fiery passion that often characterizes the proceedings of the Commons. The Lords, seasoned politicians and statesmen, are accustomed to the intricacies of legislation. They raise questions, offer suggestions, their voices calm and measured, their words carefully chosen. Imagine Lord Ashburton, a man of considerable landholdings, inquiring about the impact of the bill on agricultural prices. His voice, smooth and cultured, carries a hint of concern but not alarm. Lord Harrington, a merchant with interests in the grain trade, questions the practicality of certain regulations, his words precise and to the point. The debate continues, a slow, deliberate exchange of views and opinions. The candlelight flickers, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, creating a mesmerizing play of light and shade. The air grows heavy with the weight of words, the chamber filled with the monotonous drone of aristocratic debate. The Lords, their weariness growing with each passing moment, shift in their seats, their eyelids becoming increasingly heavy. Imagine the occasional stifled yawn, the rustling of silk robes, the subtle signs of fatigue taking hold. The Grain Act, in its slow, inexorable journey through the House of Lords, begins to exert its soporific effect. The flickering candlelight, casting a warm glow upon the crimson leather of the benches, seemed to amplify the hushed whispers circulating through the chamber. Lord Cavendish, known for his meticulous attention to detail, rose to his feet. The rustle of his starched linen echoed softly in the otherwise silent room. He adjusted his spectacles, the faint click of the metal against the bone barely audible, and began to speak, his voice a low rumble, almost swallowed by the vastness of the chamber. He addressed a seemingly minor point regarding the wording of Clause 7, subsection 3, pertaining to the transport of oats within a 5-mile radius of designated market towns. Imagine the specific wording, the precise legal language, the almost hypnotic repetition of phrases like hereinafter referred to as, and notwithstanding the aforementioned. His proposed amendment, a mere substitution of shall for may, seemed insignificant, a mere grammatical tweak, yet it sparked a flicker of debate. Lord Beaumont, a younger peer with a reputation for impatience, let out a barely perceptible sigh, the sound like the softest exhalation of air through slightly parted lips. He shifted in his seat, the velvet upholstery whispering beneath him. He questioned the necessity of such a minute alteration. Was it truly worth the chamber's time, he wondered aloud, his voice tinged with a hint of youthful exasperation, to deliberate on the difference between shall and may? Imagine the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the almost imperceptible ripple of restlessness that spread through the room. Lord Grantham, ever the pragmatist, rose to defend Lord Cavendish's amendment. He spoke slowly, deliberately, his voice a calming balm against Lord Beaumont's youthful impatience. He explained, in painstaking detail, the potential legal ramifications of using may instead of shall. He envisioned scenarios, hypothetical situations involving the movement of grain, where this seemingly minor difference in wording could lead to confusion, misinterpretation, and perhaps even litigation. Imagine him outlining these scenarios, his voice a steady drone, his words weaving a tapestry of legal complexities. He spoke of cartloads of oats, of dusty roads, of market regulations, his voice painting a vivid yet strangely soporific picture. The debate continued, a slow, measured exchange of legal arguments, each point meticulously dissected, each word carefully weighed. Imagine the pages of the bill rustling softly as the lords referred to specific clauses and subsections. Imagine the scratch of quill pens on parchment as notes were taken, amendments suggested, and revisions considered. The light from the candles flickered and danced, casting elongated shadows that stretched and receded across the richly patterned carpets, creating a mesmerizing, almost hypnotic effect. The air in the chamber grew thick with the weight of words, the atmosphere heavy with the tedium of legal discourse. The clerk of the house, his quill pen scratching across the parchment, meticulously recorded every utterance, every amendment, every objection, his hand moving in a steady, rhythmic motion. Imagine the faint scratching sound, the subtle scraping of quill against parchment, a lullaby of bureaucratic precision. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the lords reached a consensus. Lord Cavendish's amendment, the substitution of shall for may, was approved. A collective sigh, almost imperceptible, rippled through the chamber. The tension, such as it was, dissipated, replaced by a sense of quiet satisfaction, or perhaps just relief, that this particular point of contention had been resolved. The bill, now amended, was bundled up once more, the dark ribbon retied, the wax seal reaffirmed. Imagine the crisp rustle of the parchment, the soft thud of the seal being pressed into the warm wax, the finality of the gesture. The junior clerk, the same one who had delivered the bill to the lords, was summoned once again. He entered the chamber, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished wooden floor, and received the amended bill, holding it carefully in his gloved hands. He bowed low, his head inclined in deference, and retreated, his footsteps fading into the stillness of the corridor. The bill was on its way back to the House of Commons, where the Lords' amendments would be considered, debated, and perhaps even further amended. Imagine the journey back, the soft thud of the clerk's footsteps, the gentle sway of the bill in his hands, the slow, inexorable progress of the legislative process. The Grain Act, in its amended form, continued its slow, deliberate journey through the labyrinthine corridors of power, its fate hanging in the balance, its details slowly lulling the very fabric of Westminster into a state of profound, bureaucratic slumber. The Grain Act, a weighty document now bearing the subtle indentations of numerous revisions, its parchment slightly softened by handling, began the next stage of its journey. Imagine the soft glow of candlelight illuminating the clerk's path as he navigated the dimly lit corridors of Westminster, the gentle sway of the document in his hands, mirroring the rhythmic click of his heels against the polished stone floor. He carried it not with haste, but with the measured pace of one entrusted with a task of great, though arguably tedious, importance. He delivered the bill to the Speaker of the House of Commons, a figure of authority seated upon a raised dais, his wig a pristine white cloud, framing a face etched with the lines of countless parliamentary sessions. Picture the Speaker, his hand outstretched, receiving the bill with a grave nod, the gesture signifying the next phase in this meticulous dance of legislative procedure. The Speaker, his voice a practiced baritone, announced the return of the bill from the House of Lords, his words echoing through the chamber, bouncing off the wood-paneled walls and settling upon the assembled members, their faces illuminated by the flickering candlelight. Imagine the hushed anticipation, the rustling of papers as the members settled into their seats, prepared for another round of deliberations, another layer of scrutiny. Clerk of the House, his quill poised above a fresh sheet of parchment, prepared to record the proceedings, the faint scratching sound, a familiar accompaniment to the legislative process. The Lord's amendments, those meticulously crafted alterations and additions, were read aloud, each word resonating in the hushed chamber. Imagine the slow, deliberate cadence of the reading, the careful enunciation of each clause and subsection, the hypnotic repetition of legal terminology. The members listened intently, some taking notes, others simply absorbing the information, their faces betraying little emotion, their expressions masked by the shadows cast by the flickering candlelight. The amendment regarding the substitution of shall for may in Clause 7, subsection 3, regarding the transport of oats within a 5-mile radius of designated market towns was once again the subject of discussion. Imagine the murmur of voices, the low hum of debate as the members considered the implications of this seemingly minor alteration. Some argued in its favor, reiterating Lord Grantham's earlier points regarding the potential for legal ambiguity. Others questioned the necessity of such a change, echoing Lord Beaumont's initial skepticism. Imagine the back and forth of arguments, the careful weighing of words, the subtle shifts in opinion as the debate unfolded. The chamber, filled with the low murmur of voices, became a stage for a carefully orchestrated performance of parliamentary procedure. Imagine the rustling of papers, the quiet coughs, the occasional creak of a wooden chair as a member shifted in his seat. The air grew thick with the weight of words, the atmosphere charged with the static electricity of legislative discourse. Finally, after much deliberation, the House of Commons voted to accept the Lord's amendments. The decision, reached by a show of hands, was recorded by the Clerk of the House, his quill scratching across the parchment, marking another step in the bill's journey towards enactment. Imagine the quiet satisfaction, the sense of accomplishment, as this hurdle was cleared, this stage of the process completed. The Grain Act, now bearing the approval of both houses of Parliament, was ready for the final stage of its transformation from a collection of proposed regulations to the law of the land. It was prepared for royal assent. Imagine the bill, carefully rolled and tied with a dark ribbon, being carried once more through the corridors of Westminster, its destination the royal presence. The ceremony of royal assent, a ritual steeped in tradition, took place in the House of Lords. Imagine the hushed reverence, the sense of occasion as the lords assembled, their robes a sea of crimson and ermine. The king's representative, the Lord Commissioners, entered the chamber, their presence signifying the monarch's authority. Imagine the rustle of silk, the clinking of ceremonial swords as they took their places. The Clerk of the Parliament, standing before the Lord Commissioners, read aloud the title of the bill, his voice resonating through the chamber. He then intoned the traditional Norman French phrases signifying the royal assent. "Les roues les vol," he declared, the words echoing through the centuries, signifying the king's will, the final seal of approval. Imagine the weight of those words, the culmination of weeks, months even, of debate, deliberation, and painstakingly detailed revisions. The Grain Act of 1724 was now law. Imagine the sense of finality, the quiet satisfaction, as this long and arduous process reached its conclusion. The bill, now an act of Parliament, was destined for the archives, its journey complete, its fate sealed. It would become part of the historical record, a testament to the meticulous workings of the British legislative system. A document destined to gather dust on a shelf, its details fading into the mists of time. The ink, still slightly wet upon the parchment, seemed to hold the echoes of those Norman French pronouncements. Imagine the faint scent of ink, mingled with the beeswax of the candles, permeating the air. The Grain Act of 1724, now a tangible entity, a legal force, began its quiet, almost imperceptible journey into the realm of practical application. There were no trumpets, no public pronouncements, no immediate earth-shattering shifts in the market squares. Imagine, instead, the slow, almost glacial pace of implementation. The Act, meticulously copied and distributed to the relevant authorities in the various shires and boroughs, began its slow dissemination across the land. Imagine the couriers, their horses' hooves beating a steady rhythm against the cobblestone streets, carrying the news, the weight of the law contained within their saddlebags. The reaction in the weeks and months following the Act's enactment was, to put it mildly, underwhelming. Imagine the merchants in the bustling port of Bristol, continuing their trade in grain much as they had before. Imagine the farmers in the rolling fields of Lincolnshire, bringing their harvests to market, their routines undisturbed by the new regulations. The initial impact on grain prices was virtually non-existent. Imagine the price boards in the market towns, the chalked numbers remaining largely unchanged. The price of wheat, of barley, of oats continued to fluctuate according to the age-old laws of supply and demand, seemingly unaffected by the meticulously crafted clauses of the Act. Imagine the market traders, their voices echoing through the squares, their bargaining unchanged, the rhythm of commerce flowing uninterrupted. In the north, in the bustling market town of York, the price of barley remained steady, fluctuating only slightly due to a late frost that had affected the crop in the neighboring county. Imagine the farmers discussing the frost, the lost yield, the impact on their livelihoods, their conversations barely touching upon the distant pronouncements from London. The intricacies of the Grain Act, with its detailed stipulations regarding permissible price fluctuations and regulated trade routes, seemed a world away from the practical realities of the marketplace. Imagine the sacks of grain piled high in the market square, the dust motes dancing in the sunlight, the air thick with the scent of barley and oats. Further south, in the port city of Southampton, the merchants continued their brisk trade in imported grain, largely unaffected by the new regulations. Imagine the tall ships arriving from across the channel, their holds filled with grain from foreign lands, the unloading process proceeding as it had for decades. The customs officials, accustomed to the established routines, applied the existing tariffs and duties. The new act seemingly adding little to their already complex workload. Imagine the creaking of ropes, the shouts of the dock workers, the rhythmic splash of oars as small boats ferried goods to shore, the scene unchanged by the distant echoes of parliamentary procedure. The regulations regarding the import and export of grain, meticulously outlined in the Act, seemed to have little immediate effect on the established patterns of trade. Even in London, the heart of the kingdom, the impact of the Act was barely perceptible. Imagine the bakers in the narrow streets of the city continuing to bake their bread, the price of a loaf remaining largely unchanged. The regulations concerning the price of bread, a key element of the Grain Act, seemed to have little immediate effect on the baker's daily routines. Imagine the aroma of freshly baked bread wafting through the streets, the clatter of horse-drawn carts delivering flour, the sounds and smells of the city continuing their age-old rhythms. The reasons for this lack of immediate impact were multifaceted. Firstly, the Act itself was complex and required a period of adjustment and interpretation. Imagine the local magistrates poring over the densely worded document, struggling to understand the nuances of the regulations, the practical application of the law, requiring time and clarification. Secondly, the established patterns of trade and commerce proved resistant to immediate change. Imagine the networks of merchants, farmers, and traders, their established relationships and routines continuing as they had always done, the new regulations seen as a distant, abstract imposition. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the year 1724 was a year of relatively stable grain prices. Imagine the harvests, plentiful and consistent across the land, the supply of grain meeting the demand, the market forces operating in a state of relative equilibrium. The Grain Act, designed to address price fluctuations in regular trade, seemed almost superfluous in a year of such stability. Imagine the Act, sitting quietly in the archives, its potential impact dormant, awaiting the inevitable fluctuations of the market, the unforeseen challenges of future harvests, the unpredictable rhythms of supply and demand. Its presence, though quiet, represented a shift, a change in the legal landscape, a subtle alteration in the delicate balance of power and regulation. It lay in wait, a silent sentinel, ready to exert its influence when the time came, its clauses and subsections poised to play their part in the ongoing drama of trade, commerce, and the ebb and flow of the market. Its presence, though quiet, permeated the coffee houses and taverns where men of business gathered, their discussions occasionally touching upon the new regulations, their voices low and measured, their opinions cautious and reserved. Imagine the clinking of coffee cups, the murmur of conversations, the rustle of newspapers, the air thick with the aroma of tobacco and coffee. The Grain Act, a topic of conversation, but not one of passionate debate. Imagine the merchants, sipping their coffee, discussing the potential impact on their trade, their words carefully chosen, their expressions thoughtful, their overall demeanor one of cautious observation. In the countryside, the farmers tending their fields, their hands calloused from years of toil, their faces weathered by sun and wind, continued their age-old routines, largely unaware of the intricacies of the new law. Imagine the plow cutting through the earth, the rhythmic thud of hooves, the chirping of birds in the hedgerows, the sounds of rural life continuing undisturbed. The price of grain, the subject of the distant pronouncements, remained a secondary concern to the immediate realities of planting, harvesting, and ensuring the survival of their families. Imagine the farmhouse kitchens, the smell of bread baking, the chatter of children, the warmth of the hearth fire, the daily concerns of family life overshadowing the distant pronouncements of Parliament. The Grain Act, a distant whisper in the wind, barely audible above the sounds of rural life. Even in the halls of power, the Act did not generate significant excitement. The parliamentary debates surrounding its passage had been relatively subdued, lacking the fiery rhetoric and passionate arguments that often characterize discussions of more contentious issues. Imagine the hushed tones of the House of Commons, the rustling of papers, the occasional cough echoing through the chamber, the atmosphere one of measured deliberation rather than heated debate. The Act, seen as a necessary but unexciting piece of legislation, had passed through the various stages of parliamentary procedure with little fanfare. Imagine the clerks, meticulously recording the proceedings, their pens scratching across parchment, their faces impassive, their movements precise and deliberate. The Act, another entry in the annals of parliamentary history, its passage recorded with the same meticulous detail as any other piece of legislation. In the newspapers of the day, the Act received limited coverage. A few brief paragraphs tucked away amongst reports of foreign affairs and social events summarized the key provisions of the legislation. Imagine the printing presses churning out the newspapers, the ink smudging on the coarse paper, the words blurring slightly. The Act, a small item in the larger tapestry of news and information. The public, preoccupied with other matters, paid little attention to the dry details of grain regulation. Imagine the readers skimming the newspapers, their eyes scanning the headlines, their attention drawn to more sensational stories. The Grain Act, a minor detail in the daily news cycle. The general apathy surrounding the Act can be attributed to several factors. Firstly, the Act was perceived as a technical adjustment to existing regulations rather than a radical departure from established practice. Imagine the legal scholars poring over the text of the act, comparing it to previous legislation, noting the similarities and differences, their analyses dry and technical, their conclusions nuanced and complex. Secondly, the year 1724 was a period of relative peace and prosperity, and the public was more concerned with other matters. Imagine the streets of London bustling with activity, the shops filled with goods, the people going about their daily lives, their concerns focused on the immediate realities of work, family, and social life. The Grain Act, a distant concern, overshadowed by the more pressing demands of daily life. Thirdly, the act was complex and difficult to understand, and the average citizen was unlikely to delve into its intricacies. Imagine the average citizen glancing at the newspaper articles summarizing the act, their eyes glazing over at the technical jargon, their attention drifting to other matters. The act, too complex and tedious to warrant further investigation. This lack of public engagement, while perhaps understandable, is significant from a historical perspective. It highlights the disconnect between the processes of government and the lived experiences of the people. Imagine the government officials working diligently on the details of legislation, their efforts largely unseen and unappreciated by the general public, the gap between the rulers and the ruled, a constant feature of political life. It also underscores the importance of understanding public perception when analyzing the impact of historical events. Imagine the historians studying the records of the past, attempting to reconstruct the events and understand their significance. The challenge of understanding the past, a constant struggle against the limitations of the available evidence. The Grain Act of 1724, a seemingly minor piece of legislation, offers a valuable case study in the complexities of historical interpretation. Imagine the dusty archives, the shelves filled with forgotten documents. The Grain Act, a hidden gem waiting to be discovered and analyzed, its story a testament to the intricate workings of history. The Grain Act of 1724, a seemingly minor piece of legislation, wasn't written in a vacuum. It existed within a lineage, a historical continuum of laws and regulations pertaining to the buying and selling of grain. Imagine parchment scrolls, brittle with age, stacked in the dim recesses of government archives, each containing the faded script of earlier attempts to control the ebb and flow of this vital commodity. These earlier acts, like shadows stretching back through time, informed the shape and substance of the 1724 legislation. They whispered their influence into the ears of the lawmakers, shaping the debates and subtly guiding the pen strokes that brought the new act into being. One such predecessor was the Grain Act of 1709. Picture the heavy oak table in the parliamentary chamber, illuminated by flickering candlelight, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and pipe tobacco. The 1709 Act, spread out on the table, its pages rustling in the draft, focused primarily on export bounties. These bounties, essentially financial incentives, were designed to encourage the export of surplus grain, thereby stabilizing domestic prices and supporting English farmers. Imagine the scratching of quills as clerks meticulously recorded the details of these bounties, the precise amounts, the eligible grains, the conditions for payment, all documented in painstaking detail. The 1724 Act, while not directly altering these bounties, subtly shifted the emphasis, focusing more on internal regulation. Imagine the lawmakers, their faces illuminated by the flickering candlelight, debating the nuances of these changes, their voices low and measured, their arguments focused on the finer points of economic policy. Another antecedent, the assize of bread and ale, dating back to the medieval period, provided a framework for regulating the price and quality of bread. Imagine the bustling marketplaces of medieval towns, the cries of vendors hawking their wares, the aroma of freshly baked bread filling the air. The assize, a complex set of regulations, dictated the weight and price of bread loaves based on the prevailing price of grain. Imagine the town officials meticulously weighing loaves of bread, ensuring they conform to the prescribed standards, their renouncements echoing through the marketplace, maintaining order and fairness in the trade of essential goods. While the 1724 Act didn't directly address the assize, it operated within the same overarching principle of government intervention in the grain market. Imagine the legal scholars poring over ancient texts, tracing the evolution of grain regulation from the medieval period to the 18th century. Their analyses revealing the long history of government involvement in this vital sector of the economy. The differences between the 1724 Act and its predecessors, while seemingly minor, offer a glimpse into the evolving economic landscape of 18th century Britain. The earlier acts, often reactive responses to specific crises, focused on immediate solutions, such as export bounties or price controls. Imagine the emergency meetings of government officials, hastily convened in response to food shortages or price spikes. Their deliberations focused on finding quick and effective solutions to pressing problems. The 1724 Act, by contrast, reflected a more proactive approach, aiming to create a more stable and predictable market environment. Imagine the long hours spent drafting the legislation, the careful consideration of various scenarios, the meticulous attention to detail, all aimed at creating a more robust and resilient system of grain regulation. Furthermore, the 1724 Act introduced more sophisticated mechanisms for monitoring and regulating the grain trade. Imagine the clerks diligently recording the details of grain transactions, the volumes bought and sold, the prices agreed upon, the movement of grain across the country, all meticulously documented in government ledgers. These records, a testament to the growing bureaucracy of the 18th century state, provided a wealth of data that could be used to inform policy decisions. Imagine the government officials studying these records, analyzing the trends and patterns, using the information to fine-tune the regulations. Their decisions based on data rather than intuition or guesswork. This data-driven approach, while not entirely novel, represented a significant shift in the way grain regulation was conceived and implemented. The 1724 Act also differed from earlier legislation in its scope and application. Previous acts often focused on specific regions or types of grain. Imagine the regional variations in grain production, the different types of wheat and barley grown in different parts of the country, the regulations tailored to the specific circumstances of each region. The 1724 Act, while acknowledging these regional differences, aimed to create a more unified national framework for grain regulation. Imagine the maps spread out on the table showing the different grain-producing regions of the country. The discussions focused on finding a balance between national uniformity and regional specificity. They aimed to create a system that would work effectively across the entire country. This broader perspective reflected the growing integration of the British economy and the increasing role of the central government in managing economic affairs. These subtle shifts, barely perceptible to the casual observer, represent the slow, incremental evolution of government policy. They reveal the ongoing dialogue between past practices and present needs, the constant adaptation of regulations to changing circumstances, the intricate workings of the legislative process. Imagine the layers of parchment, each representing a different stage in the development of the Act. The amendments and revisions, the deletions and additions, the final text, a palimpsest of earlier versions, a testament to the complex and evolving nature of lawmaking. This intricate dance between national and regional interests, this careful balancing act between uniformity and specificity, lay at the heart of the economic theories underpinning the 1724 Grain Act. Imagine the hushed whispers in dimly lit rooms, the scratching of quills on parchment, the murmur of debate as learned men grappled with these complex concepts. The prevailing economic philosophy of the time, mercantilism, cast a long shadow over these deliberations. Imagine thick, leather-bound volumes filled with economic treatises, their pages dog-eared and annotated, the margins filled with scribbled calculations and observations. Mercantilism, with its emphasis on national wealth and self-sufficiency, viewed grain as a strategic commodity, essential to the nation's prosperity and security. Imagine granaries overflowing with golden wheat, a symbol of the nation's abundance and strength, a bulwark against famine and hardship. The 1724 Act, while not explicitly stating its mercantilist underpinnings, reflected this philosophy in its emphasis on regulating the grain trade to ensure national stability. Imagine the flow of grain across the country, carefully monitored and controlled, ensuring that every region had sufficient supplies, preventing shortages and price spikes. The act aimed to create a system that would benefit both producers and consumers, balancing the interests of farmers and urban populations. Imagine the farmers, their hands calloused from years of toil, bringing their grain to market, confident that they would receive a fair price for their labor. Imagine the townspeople, queuing patiently at the bakery, assured that they could afford to buy bread for their families. The Act's framers believed that by carefully managing the grain trade, they could prevent the wild fluctuations in prices that had plagued earlier eras. Imagine the charts and graphs, meticulously drawn by government clerks, showing the peaks and valleys of grain prices over the years, the sharp spikes, indicating times of scarcity, the deep troughs, representing periods of abundance. These fluctuations, they argued, disrupted the economy, causing hardship for both farmers and consumers. Imagine the anxiety of farmers, watching the price of grain plummet, their livelihoods threatened by forces beyond their control. Imagine the desperation of families struggling to afford bread, their meager income stretched to the breaking point. The 1724 Act, with its emphasis on stability and predictability, sought to smooth out these fluctuations, creating a more stable and equitable market. The Act's theoretical underpinnings were further complicated by the then-emerging theories of free markets, albeit still nascent. Imagine whispered discussions in coffee houses, pamphlets circulating amongst intellectuals, new ideas challenging the established order. These early proponents of free markets argued that government intervention distorted the natural workings of the market, leading to inefficiencies and unintended consequences. Imagine the lively debates between proponents of mercantilism and advocates of free markets, their arguments clashing, their voices rising and falling in the heat of discussion. While the 1724 Act did not fully embrace free market principles, it did incorporate some elements of this emerging school of thought. Imagine the subtle shifts in language, the nuanced changes in phrasing reflecting the influence of these new ideas. The Act's allowance for some degree of price flexibility, for instance, represented a departure from the strict price controls of earlier regulations. Imagine the sliding scales used to determine grain prices, allowing for some variation based on market conditions, a recognition that prices could not be fixed rigidly by government decree. This flexibility, however small, acknowledged the role of supply and demand in determining prices, a concept central to free market theory. Imagine the careful calculations used to determine the appropriate range for price fluctuations, balancing the need for stability with the realities of market forces. However, the practical application of these economic theories proved far more challenging than their theoretical formulation. Imagine the difficulties of implementing the Act in the real world, the complexities of the grain trade, the regional variations in production and consumption, the challenges of enforcement. The Act's provisions, while seemingly clear and straightforward on paper, often prove difficult to interpret and apply in practice. Imagine the magistrates struggling to apply the Act's provisions in their local jurisdictions, the ambiguities in the wording leading to confusion and disagreement. Imagine the appeals and legal challenges, the disputes over interpretation, the slow and cumbersome legal process. The 1724 Grain Act, despite its meticulous design, encountered the inevitable complexities of the real world. Imagine the dusty ledgers filled with records of grain transactions, the entries meticulously recorded, yet still failing to capture the full complexity of the market. The Act's impact on the day-to-day lives of ordinary people, while intended to be beneficial, remained a subject of ongoing debate and discussion. Imagine the conversations in market squares, the whispers in taverns, the ordinary people discussing the impact of the Act on their lives. Their opinions varied and often contradictory. The whispers in taverns, the hushed conversations in market squares, these were the true testing grounds of the 1724 Grain Act. Imagine the dimly lit interior of a tavern, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on the rough-hewn wooden tables, the air thick with the smells of ale and tobacco, the murmur of voices punctuated by the occasional clinking of tankards. Here, amidst the everyday bustle, the impact of the Act was felt, debated, and sometimes even ignored. One documented case tucked away in the dusty archives of a small market town in Oxfordshire tells the story of a miller named Thomas Cartwright. Imagine the creaking of the mill wheel, the rhythmic grinding of the stones, the fine white dust settling on everything in sight. Cartwright, a man of modest means, found himself facing a dilemma in the autumn of 1726. Imagine the furrowed brow of the miller, his hands calloused and worn as he contemplates his predicament. The harvest had been poor that year, the rains had come late, and his yield was significantly lower than usual. Imagine the parched fields, the stunted stalks of wheat, the meager harvest gathered into small bundles. According to the Grain Act, he was obligated to sell his grain at the prescribed price, a price that barely covered his costs. Imagine the ledger book open on his table, the neat rows of figures showing the stark reality of his situation. The prescribed price, while designed to protect consumers, left him with little profit, barely enough to feed his family and maintain his mill. Imagine the worried faces of his wife and children, their future uncertain, their livelihoods threatened by the poor harvest. Faced with this difficult choice, Cartwright decided to sell a portion of his grain on the black market, where he could fetch a higher price. Imagine the clandestine meeting in the dead of night, the sacks of grain loaded onto a waiting cart, the whispered exchange of money. This act of defiance, though driven by necessity, put him in direct violation of the act. Imagine the magistrate's stern face, the heavy hand of the law poised to come down on the miller. The records show that Cartwright was eventually caught, his illicit dealings brought to light by a rival miller. Imagine the whispered accusations, the envy and resentment simmering beneath the surface of the small community. He was fined a substantial sum, a penalty that further strained his already precarious finances. Imagine the emptying of his meager savings, the heavy burden of the fine weighing down on him. This case, though seemingly insignificant, highlights the challenges of implementing the act in the face of individual circumstances and economic realities. Another case, recorded in the annals of a coastal town in Suffolk, reveals a different kind of challenge. Imagine the salty air, the cries of gulls overhead, the bustling port filled with ships from distant lands. This case involved a merchant named Elizabeth Thornton, a shrewd businesswoman who traded in grain and other commodities. Imagine the crisp white sails of her ship billowing in the wind, the hold filled with sacks of grain destined for foreign markets. The 1724 Act, designed primarily for domestic trade, was less clear on the regulations governing international trade. Imagine the complex legal documents, the ambiguous wording, the loopholes and exceptions that could be exploited by those with the knowledge and resources to do so. Thornton, exploiting this ambiguity, managed to export a significant quantity of grain at a price higher than the prescribed domestic price. Imagine the carefully crafted contracts, the clandestine negotiations, the profits flowing into her coffers. Her actions, while not strictly illegal, skirted the boundaries of the act, raising questions about its effectiveness in regulating the grain trade in a globalized market. Imagine the debates in Parliament, the calls for greater clarity and stricter enforcement, the ongoing struggle to adapt the act to the changing realities of international trade. These two cases, among many others, illustrate the complexities and contradictions inherent in the application of the 1724 Grain Act. The act, designed to bring stability and order to the grain market, often encountered the messy realities of human behavior, economic necessity, and the ever-shifting dynamics of supply and demand. Imagine the endless flow of grain across the country, the intricate network of producers, traders, and consumers, each with their own motivations and interests. The Act, despite its best intentions, could not fully control this complex and dynamic system. Imagine the subtle shifts in prices, the fluctuations in supply, the unpredictable forces that shaped the market. These forces, though invisible, exerted a powerful influence on the lives of ordinary people, shaping their fortunes and their destinies. The 1724 Grain Act, like a ship navigating a turbulent sea, was constantly buffeted by these unseen currents, its course sometimes diverted, its destination sometimes uncertain. The 1724 Grain Act, like a ship navigating a turbulent sea, was constantly buffeted by these unseen currents, its course sometimes diverted, its destination sometimes uncertain. Imagine the creaking timbers of the ship, the groaning ropes, the constant struggle against the elements, and within this ship, a multitude of smaller stories unfolded, each one a microcosm of the larger struggle to regulate the grain trade. Consider, for instance, the case of Thomas Ashton, a justice of the peace in the small village of Ashworth in Lancashire. Imagine the quiet village green, the church spire rising against the gray sky, the slow pace of life undisturbed by the clamor of the city. Ashton, a man of some standing in the community, was tasked with enforcing the Grain Act within his jurisdiction. Imagine the heavy weight of responsibility on his shoulders, the expectation of fairness and impartiality. His role was not an easy one. The Act, with its complex regulations and intricate clauses, required meticulous record-keeping and a thorough understanding of its provisions. Imagine the stacks of parchment on his desk, the quill pen scratching across the paper, the hours spent poring over the details of the Act. He had to maintain accurate records of grain prices, monitor the activities of local millers and merchants, and investigate any suspected violations of the Act. Imagine the ledger books filled with neat rows of figures, the meticulous notes on each transaction, the careful documentation of every detail. This was a time-consuming and often tedious task, made more difficult by the limited resources at his disposal. Imagine the dimly lit office, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on the walls, the solitary figure hunched over his desk. He had no dedicated staff to assist him, relying instead on the assistance of local constables and informers. Imagine the whispered conversations in the village tavern, the veiled accusations and rumors, the network of informants providing Ashton with snippets of information. The effectiveness of his enforcement efforts often depended on the cooperation of the local community, a cooperation that was not always forthcoming. Imagine the suspicious glances, the reluctance to report neighbors and friends, the subtle resistance to the authority of the Act. Some villagers, struggling with the low prices mandated by the Act, saw it as an imposition, a burden that threatened their livelihoods. Imagine the hushed conversations in the marketplace, the shared grievances, the simmering resentment towards the Act. Others, benefiting from the stable prices, were more supportive, but even their support was often passive rather than active. Imagine the quiet acceptance, the resignation to the dictates of the Act, the lack of enthusiasm for its enforcement. Ashton, caught in the middle of these conflicting interests, had to navigate a delicate balance between upholding the law and maintaining the peace within the community. Imagine the careful diplomacy, the measured words, the constant effort to avoid escalating tensions. One particular case illustrates the challenges he faced. A local farmer, struggling to make ends meet, had sold a small quantity of grain above the prescribed price. Imagine the weathered face of the farmer, his hands calloused from years of toil, the desperation in his eyes. The violation was minor, the extra income barely enough to feed his family, but Ashton was obligated to investigate. Imagine the reluctant questioning, the farmer's mumbled explanations, the uncomfortable silence in the small room. He could have imposed a fine, as the Act required, but doing so would have further impoverished the farmer and likely fueled resentment towards the Act. Imagine the internal debate, the weighing of competing interests, the search for a just solution. Instead, he issued a warning, a stern reprimand coupled with a reminder of the farmer's obligations under the Act. Imagine the farmer's relief, the unspoken gratitude, the fragile truce maintained between the law and the realities of rural life. This pragmatic approach, though not strictly adhering to the letter of the law, allowed Ashton to maintain order and avoid exacerbating the hardships faced by the community. It was a delicate balancing act, a constant negotiation between the ideals of the Act and the practicalities of its implementation. Imagine the tightrope walker carefully placing one foot in front of the other, maintaining balance with every step. The records show that Ashton diligently documented every case, every investigation, every warning issued. Imagine the meticulously kept records, the detailed accounts of each incident, the evidence of his tireless efforts to enforce the Act. These records, though dry and bureaucratic, offer a glimpse into the challenges faced by local officials in implementing the 1724 Grain Act. They reveal the complexities of enforcing a law that often clashed with the economic realities of rural life, a law that required a nuanced approach, a sensitivity to the needs of the community. Imagine the faded ink on the yellowed parchment, the whispers of the past, the stories hidden within the bureaucratic details. These stories, though often overlooked, are an essential part of the history of the 1724 Grain Act, a testament to the human element in the machinery of government. These stories, though often overlooked, are an essential part of the history of the 1724 Grain Act, a testament to the human element in the machinery of government. They also illuminate the Act's subtle, almost imperceptible ripples across the social fabric of rural England. Imagine the quiet fields, the wind whispering through the stalks of barley, the rhythmic sway of the wheat in the summer breeze. For the farmers toiling under the sun, the Act represented a nuanced change, a shift so subtle it almost blended into the background hum of daily life. The Act, designed to stabilize grain prices, theoretically offered a measure of predictability. Imagine the farmer calculating his expected yield, the careful estimations based on the regulated price, the sense of stability, however tenuous. This predictability in theory could allow for better planning, more informed decisions about planting and harvesting. Imagine the careful marking of dates in a well-worn almanac, the notations about planting schedules, the anticipation of the harvest. However, the reality often fell short of the ideal. The fixed prices, while offering stability, could also limit potential profits. Imagine the farmer surveying his bountiful harvest, the abundance exceeding his expectations, the bittersweet realization that the surplus would not translate into increased income. The regulated price remained, regardless of the abundance or scarcity of the harvest. Imagine the sacks of grain piled high in the barn, the overflowing storage bins, the muted sense of frustration. For the consumer in the bustling marketplace, the impact was similarly muted. Imagine the vibrant colors of the market stalls, the cacophony of bartering voices, the aroma of freshly baked bread. The Act aimed to make grain more affordable, ensuring a steady supply at a reasonable price. Imagine the housewife carefully counting out her coins, the purchase of a loaf of bread, the small comfort of a predictable expense. Stability in price could provide a sense of security, a reassurance that the basic necessities remained within reach. Imagine the family gathered around the table. A simple meal of bread and cheese, the sense of normalcy in a world often characterized by uncertainty. However, the Act did not dramatically alter the cost of living. The changes were incremental, almost imperceptible in the day-to-day transactions. Imagine the subtle shift in the price of a loaf of bread, the barely noticeable difference in the weekly grocery bill, the quiet acceptance of the new norm. The 1724 Grain Act did not usher in an era of unprecedented affordability. It simply nudged the existing economic landscape, creating a ripple effect that was felt more in the aggregate than in the individual experience. Imagine a pebble dropped into a still pond, the concentric circles expanding outwards, the gradual dissipation of the initial impact. Consider the baker, his hands dusted with flour, the warmth of the oven radiating onto his face. The regulated price of grain meant a predictable cost for his primary ingredient. Imagine the baker meticulously measuring out the flour, the careful kneading of the dough, the rhythmic movements honed over years of practice. This predictability allowed for more accurate cost calculations, a more stable business model. Imagine the neat rows of figures in the baker's ledger, the careful tracking of expenses and income, the sense of control over his livelihood. However, the Act also limited his ability to capitalize on fluctuations in grain prices. Imagine a poor harvest in a neighboring county, the scarcity driving up grain prices, the baker unable to increase his own prices to reflect the increased cost of his raw materials. He could not benefit from periods of scarcity, nor could he significantly lower his prices during times of abundance to attract more customers. Imagine the baker shaking his head, the quiet acceptance of the limitations imposed by the Act, the understanding that stability came at a price. The impact on millers was similarly nuanced. The Act regulated the price at which they could purchase grain from farmers and sell flour to bakers. Imagine the miller adjusting the grindstones, the rhythmic whirring of the mill wheel, the steady flow of grain into flour. This regulation, while providing a framework for their operations, also restricted their flexibility in responding to market fluctuation. Imagine the miller receiving a shipment of inferior quality grain, the lower price mandated by the act not reflecting the reduced quality, the quiet frustration simmering beneath the surface. The 1724 Grain Act created a system of checks and balances, a complex web of regulations that aimed to control the flow of grain from the field to the table. Imagine the intricate network of transactions. The flow of grain from farmer to miller to baker to consumer, the invisible hand of the act guiding the process. This system, while designed to promote stability, also introduced a degree of rigidity, a limitation on the free play of market forces. Imagine a tightly wound clock mechanism. The precise movements of the gears, the delicate balance maintained by the intricate interplay of its parts. The 1724 Grain Act, in its attempt to regulate the grain trade, created a system that was both stabilizing and constraining. A system that touched the lives of farmers, millers, bakers, and consumers in ways that were often subtle and unseen. Imagine the quiet workings of the act, the invisible hand shaping the economic landscape, the subtle ripples spreading through the fabric of rural life. And so the years passed. Imagine the turning of the seasons, the slow cyclical rhythm of rural life. The Grain Act remained, a quiet presence in the background, a constant factor in the economic equation. Imagine the rustling of leaves in the autumn breeze, the bare branches of winter trees silhouetted against the gray sky, the first green shoots of spring emerging from the thawing earth, the golden fields of summer swaying gently in the warm sun. The act, neither a resounding success nor a catastrophic failure, simply was. Imagine the weathered pages of the act, the faded ink, the brittle parchment, a testament to its enduring presence. Its long-term impact on the British economy was less a dramatic shift and more a gentle nudge, a subtle adjustment to the existing order. Imagine a ship adjusting its course, the slight turn of the rudder, the barely perceptible change in direction, the gradual arrival at a new destination. The act did not magically eliminate poverty, nor did it usher in an era of unprecedented prosperity. Imagine the bustling streets of London, the stark contrast between the opulent carriages of the wealthy and the ragged clothes of the poor, the ever-present gap between the haves and the have-nots. The act did not fundamentally alter this dynamic. Imagine a street vendor hawking his wares, the hopeful glint in his eye, the meager earnings barely enough to sustain his family, the quiet struggle for survival. Life continued, with its usual mix of joys and sorrows, its triumphs and setbacks. Imagine a child playing in the street, the carefree laughter echoing in the alleyways, the simple pleasures of childhood offering a temporary escape from the harsh realities of life. Consider the larger economic forces at play: international trade, population growth, technological advancements. These factors too shape the economic landscape. Imagine a merchant ship arriving in port. The exotic goods from distant lands, the bustling activity of the docks, the constant flow of commerce connecting Britain to the wider world. The Grain Act was but one piece of a complex puzzle, its influence intertwined with numerous other factors. Imagine a tapestry woven with intricate threads, each thread representing a different economic force, the Grain Act forming a subtle pattern within the larger design. The Act's impact on inflation is a subject of ongoing debate amongst economic historians. Imagine a group of scholars gathered around a table, the animated discussion about the nuances of economic theory, the passionate arguments about the interpretation of historical data, the ongoing quest for a deeper understanding of the past. Some argue that the Act contributed to price stability, while others contend that it had little discernible effect. Imagine a stack of dusty ledgers, the meticulously recorded figures detailing grain prices, trade volumes, and market trends, the raw data providing a glimpse into the economic realities of the past. Disentangling the Act's influence from other contributing factors is a challenging task, a puzzle with many missing pieces. Imagine an archaeologist carefully excavating a site, the painstaking process of uncovering fragments of the past, the slow reconstruction of a lost world. One thing is certain: the 1724 Grain Act did not cause a dramatic economic upheaval. Imagine the steady rhythm of daily life, the familiar routines of work and leisure, the absence of any sudden or disruptive changes. It did not trigger widespread protests, nor did it lead to significant social unrest. Imagine the quiet hum of activity in a village, the farmers tending their fields, the blacksmith hammering at his anvil, the children playing in the streets, the sense of normalcy pervading the air. The act, in its own quiet way, became part of the fabric of rural life, an accepted element of the economic landscape. Imagine a farmer surveying his fields, the satisfaction of a good harvest, the quiet acceptance of the regulated price. The act's legacy is perhaps best understood in its absence. When it was eventually repealed, its removal did not cause significant disruption. Imagine the quiet removal of a law from the books, the subtle shift in the legal landscape, the almost imperceptible change in the daily lives of ordinary people. The economic system adapted, adjusting to the new reality with relative ease. Imagine a river changing its course, the gradual erosion of the banks, the slow formation of a new channel, the seamless flow of water adapting to the altered terrain. This suggests that the act's impact, while present, was not so deeply ingrained as to be irreplaceable. Imagine a tree casting a shadow, the cool shade providing temporary respite from the sun, the disappearance of the shadow, leaving no lasting mark on the ground. The 1724 Grain Act, a quiet actor on the stage of history, left a subtle, yet ultimately unremarkable imprint on the British economy. Imagine the closing of a history book, the quiet settling of dust on the cover, the story fading into the recesses of time, the quiet removal of a law, a parchment scrolled and tied with a ribbon, placed in a box, then in a vault, fading from immediate memory. The 1724 Grain Act, like all things, began its slow decline into obsolescence. Imagine the slow decay of a once vibrant tapestry, the colors fading, the threads loosening, the intricate patterns gradually blurring. The vibrant hues of its initial impact, the debates, the anxieties, the hopes, all began to soften with the passage of time. Consider the shifting sands of agricultural practice. New techniques emerged, new tools were developed, new crops were introduced. Imagine a farmer experimenting with a new plow, the careful adjustment of the blade, the hope for a more bountiful harvest, the slow embrace of innovation, crop rotation, selective breeding, improved drainage. These incremental advancements, like tiny rivulets carving new paths through the earth, gradually reshaped the agricultural landscape. The act, designed for a specific set of circumstances, began to feel like an old coat, once perfectly fitted, now slightly too tight in some places, too loose in others. Imagine a tailor meticulously measuring a client, the careful attention to detail, the precise adjustments to ensure a perfect fit, the garment eventually becoming outdated as fashions change. The expansion of trade networks further eroded the act's relevance. Imagine the masts of tall ships silhouetted against the horizon, the sails billowing in the wind, the arrival of goods from distant lands, the ever-expanding reach of commerce. As Britain's trade relations with other nations deepened, the domestic grain market became increasingly integrated into a global network. Imagine a spider spinning its web, the intricate connections extending outwards, the delicate threads linking distant points, the creation of a complex and interconnected system. The Act, focused on regulating internal trade, struggled to keep pace with these external forces. Imagine a small dam trying to control a mighty river, the relentless flow of water eventually overwhelming the barrier, the inevitable surrender to a larger force. The rise of new economic theories also contributed to the Act's decline. Imagine a scholar poring over a book, the flickering candlelight illuminating the pages, the deep contemplation of complex ideas, the gradual emergence of new understanding. Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, challenged the prevailing mercantilist views that underpin the Grain Act. Imagine a wave crashing against the shore, the relentless force of nature reshaping the coastline, the gradual erosion of old structures. Smith's arguments for free markets and minimal government intervention gained traction, slowly chipping away at the intellectual foundations of the Act. Imagine a sculptor chipping away at a block of marble, the careful removal of excess material, the gradual revelation of the form within. the slow creation of a new masterpiece. The slow, almost imperceptible shift in public opinion further weakened the act's position. Imagine a whisper spreading through a crowd, the quiet murmur of discontent, the gradual erosion of confidence, the subtle shift in the collective mood. The act, once seen as a necessary measure to ensure stability, began to be perceived as an unnecessary constraint on economic activity. Imagine a tightly wound spring slowly unwinding, the gradual release of tension, the return to a more relaxed state. The clamor for its repeal, though not a thunderous roar, became a persistent hum, a constant background noise, eroding the act's authority. Imagine the dripping of water on a stone, the constant, almost imperceptible erosion, the gradual wearing away of the surface, the slow but inevitable transformation. Changes in demographics also played a role. Population growth and urbanization shifted the balance between rural and urban populations. Imagine the bustling streets of a growing city, the influx of people from the countryside, the expansion of urban centers, the changing demographics reshaping the nation. The act, designed with a primarily agrarian society in mind, became increasingly ill-suited to the needs of a rapidly urbanizing nation. Imagine a tailor trying to alter a garment for a growing child, the adjustments becoming increasingly difficult, the eventual need for a completely new outfit. The gradual accumulation of these factors, like layers of sediment slowly building up over time, eventually buried the act under the weight of changing circumstances. Imagine a forgotten artifact buried beneath layers of earth. The slow accumulation of dust and debris, the gradual concealment of the object, the fading of its memory. The act, once a prominent feature of the economic landscape, became a relic of the past, a fading echo of a bygone era. Imagine a faint whisper carried on the wind, the barely audible sound fading into the distance, the gradual disappearance into silence. The act's story is not one of dramatic collapse, but of slow, gradual decline, a quiet fading away into the background noise of history. Imagine a leaf falling from a tree, the gentle descent to the ground, the slow decay into the earth, the quiet return to the cycle of nature. The quiet return to the cycle of nature. Imagine a farmer's field, the furrows freshly plowed, the dark earth exposed to the sun, the seeds sown in neat rows. The 1724 Grain Act, like a seed planted in a specific time and place, eventually reached the end of its natural lifespan. The soil of economic thought had shifted, the climate of public opinion had changed, and the act, once a vibrant green shoot, began to wither. Consider the pamphlets circulating amongst the coffee houses of London, their pages filled with dense text, the ink smudged from countless hands, the arguments for and against the act laid out in meticulous detail. Imagine the murmur of voices in those dimly lit rooms, the clinking of coffee cups, the rustling of pamphlets, the low hum of debate. The arguments against the act gained momentum, like a snowball rolling down a hill, gathering size and speed as it descended. Some argued that the act interfered with the natural workings of the market. Imagine a scale, its two sides perfectly balanced, the delicate equilibrium disrupted by an external force. The act, they claimed, distorted the natural balance of supply and demand, leading to artificial price fluctuations. Imagine the scale tipping first one way, then the other, the instability caused by the interference. The free flow of grain, they insisted, would ensure stable prices and a more efficient allocation of resources. Imagine a river flowing freely, its waters finding their own course, the natural distribution of resources across the landscape. Others criticized the act for its complexity and bureaucratic burden. Imagine a clerk hunched over a desk, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows, the piles of paperwork surrounding him, the endless forms and regulations to navigate. The act, with its intricate system of licenses, permits, and inspections, created a labyrinthine bureaucracy that stifled trade and hampered economic growth. Imagine a traveler lost in a maze, the twisting paths leading to dead ends, the frustration and confusion of navigating a complex system. Still others pointed to the act's unintended consequences. Imagine a farmer struggling to sell his surplus grain, the restrictions imposed by the act limiting his market access, the the frustration of seeing his hard-earned harvest go to waste. The act, designed to protect consumers from high prices, sometimes led to shortages and gluts, harming both producers and consumers. Imagine a warehouse overflowing with grain, the surplus rotting away, the waste caused by the act's unintended consequences. The calls for reform grew louder. Imagine a petition circulating, the signatures accumulating, the growing list of names representing the rising tide of discontent. Some advocated for minor adjustments, tweaking the existing regulations to address specific concerns. Imagine a tailor making small alterations to a garment, the careful adjustments to improve the fit, the subtle changes to enhance the appearance. Others demanded a complete overhaul of the system, a radical restructuring of the grain trade. Imagine a builder demolishing an old structure, the careful dismantling of the existing framework, the clearing of the ground to make way for something new, and a growing number called for the act's outright repeal. Imagine a document being torn in two, the decisive break with the past, the symbolic rejection of the old order. They argued that the act was outdated, ineffective, and detrimental to the nation's economic interests. Imagine a ship casting off its moorings, the ropes untied, the vessel setting sail towards a new horizon, the embrace of a new direction. These diverse perspectives, like different threads woven into a complex tapestry, reflected the changing economic and social landscape of 18th century Britain. Imagine a loom, the shuttle moving back and forth, the threads interlacing, the gradual creation of a complex pattern. The act, once seen as a necessary safeguard against famine and instability, was increasingly viewed as an impediment to progress. Imagine a gate blocking a road, the obstacle preventing forward movement, the need to remove the barrier to continue the journey. The debate over the act's future intensified, the arguments becoming more pointed, the stakes higher. Imagine the temperature rising in a room, the heat of the debate intensifying, the passions flaring, the sense of urgency growing. The act's fate hung in the balance, like a pendulum swinging back and forth, the uncertainty of which way it would eventually fall. The stage was set for a showdown, a clash between the old order and the new, a struggle for the future of the grain trade. Imagine two armies facing each other across a battlefield. The tension in the air, the anticipation of the coming conflict, the uncertainty of the outcome. The pendulum swung, and in the hushed chambers of Parliament, amidst the rustle of silk and the creak of leather, the first whispers of repeal began to echo. Imagine the faintest of breezes stirring the heavy drapes, a precursor to a gathering storm. Not a sudden gust, mind you, but the merest displacement of air, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The process, as with all things parliamentary, was a slow, deliberate unfolding. Picture a tightly furled scroll, slowly unrolling, inch by painstaking inch, revealing its contents with agonizing gradualness. First a notice of motion, a formal declaration of intent, penned in elegant script on thick parchment. Imagine the quill pen scratching across the surface, leaving a trail of dark ink, each stroke precise and deliberate. This notice, posted on the designated board, a dark oak panel worn smooth by years of use, announced the intention to introduce a bill to repeal the 1724 Grain Act. Imagine the faint tapping of a hammer as the notice is affixed to the board, the small sound echoing in the otherwise silent chamber. Then came the drafting of the bill itself, a meticulous process involving consultations with legal experts, clerks, and advisors. Imagine a dimly lit room filled with the murmur of voices, the scratching of pens on paper, the rustle of documents, each clause, each phrase, each word, carefully considered and debated. Imagine a magnifying glass held over the text, scrutinizing every detail, ensuring precision and clarity. The language, dense and formal, filled with legal jargon and technical terms. Imagine the weight of the words, their significance, their potential impact on the lives of countless people. The bill, once drafted, was presented to the House of Commons for its first reading. Imagine the Speaker in his ceremonial robes and wig reading the title of the bill aloud, his voice echoing in the cavernous chamber. This first reading was a formality, a mere announcement of the bill's existence, a prelude to the more substantive debates to come. Imagine the hushed silence of the chamber, the members listening intently, their faces impassive, their minds already at work, analyzing the implications of the proposed legislation. The second reading was the crucial stage, the moment of truth, where the merits of the bill were debated and scrutinized. Imagine the chamber buzzing with activity, the members taking their seats, the murmur of conversations filling the air. Supporters of the repeal argued passionately, their voices rising and falling, their gestures animated. Imagine the flow of their words, the persuasive arguments, the appeals to reason and common sense. They pointed to the act's unintended consequences, the burden on farmers, the distortions in the market, the complexity of the regulations. Imagine their hands, gesturing, emphasizing their points, painting a picture of the act's detrimental effects. Opponents, equally fervent, defended the act, highlighting its perceived benefits, the protection it offered consumers, the stability it provided. Imagine their counter-arguments, their attempts to refute the claims of the repeal supporters, their defense of the existing legislation. They warned of the potential dangers of deregulation, the risk of price volatility, the possibility of shortages. Imagine the tension in the air, the clash of opposing viewpoints, the battle of ideas. The debate raged for days, sometimes stretching late into the night, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the chamber. Imagine the exhaustion on the faces of the members, the strain of the long hours, the intensity of the debate. The arguments, often repetitive, sometimes tedious, reflected the deep divisions within Parliament and the wider society. Imagine the repetition of certain phrases, the echoing of key arguments, the slow, grinding process of parliamentary debate. Each side presented evidence, cited statistics, quoted experts, and appealed to tradition, precedent, and principle. Imagine the rustling of papers, the consultation of notes, the presentation of charts and graphs. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the vote was called. Imagine the hush that fell over the chamber, the anticipation, the sense of momentous occasion. The members filed past the tellers, their voices barely audible as they declared their aye or nay. Imagine the slow counting of the votes, the tension mounting, the uncertainty of the outcome. The clerk, his voice clear and steady, announced the results. The bill to repeal the 1724 Grain Act had passed its second reading. A collective sigh, barely perceptible, rippled through the chamber. Imagine the release of tension, the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the sense of a decision made, a step taken. The pendulum had swung. The act, once seen as a cornerstone of agricultural policy, was now one step closer to oblivion. Imagine a stone being dislodged from a wall, the first crack in the edifice, the beginning of the inevitable collapse. The process, however, was far from over. There were still hurdles to overcome, further debates to endure before the act could finally be consigned to the dustbin of history. Imagine a long and winding road stretching ahead. The journey far from complete, the destination still distant, but the direction clear. The journey indeed was far from over. The bill, having survived its second reading, now faced the scrutiny of the committee stage. Imagine the members of the committee gathering in a smaller, more intimate room, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of candles. The atmosphere, though less formal than the main chamber, was no less serious. Imagine the rustle of papers as the bill was laid out on the table, its clauses and subclauses meticulously examined. The committee stage was where the fine print was dissected, the nuances debated, the commas and semicolons scrutinized. Imagine a quill pen hovering over the parchment, poised to make amendments, to strike out words, to insert new phrases. Every line, every phrase, every word subject to intense scrutiny. Imagine the members leaning in, their brows furrowed in concentration, their eyes scanning the text, searching for ambiguities, inconsistencies, or potential loopholes. The debates in committee, while less dramatic than those in the main chamber, were no less important. Imagine the quiet murmur of voices, the exchange of opinions, the reasoned arguments, the occasional whispered aside. The focus was on the technicalities, the procedural details, the precise wording of the legislation. Imagine the turning of pages, the consultation of legal text, the referencing of precedents, the citing of statutes. One member, a meticulous lawyer known for his attention to detail, raised a question about the definition of grain within the context of the bill. Imagine his voice, precise and measured, outlining his concerns, pointing to potential ambiguities, suggesting alternative formulations. Another member, a seasoned politician with a reputation for pragmatism, proposed an amendment to clarify the time frame for the implementation of the repeal. Imagine his words, carefully chosen, seeking to balance competing interests, to ensure a smooth transition, to avoid unintended consequences. The discussions continued for hours, sometimes stretching late into the night. Imagine the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows on the walls, the air thick with the smell of beeswax and parchment. The members, fueled by strong coffee and sheer willpower, pored over the text, their minds focused on the task at hand. Imagine the weariness in their eyes, the slight slump of their shoulders, the occasional stifled yawn. Clerk, his pen scratching furiously, diligently recorded the amendments, the revisions, the additions, and the deletions. Imagine the growing pile of notes, the accumulation of changes, the transformation of the bill from its initial draft to its amended form. Each amendment, however minor, was debated and voted upon. Imagine the raising of hands, the counting of votes, the declaration of the results, the monotonous repetition of the process. One amendment, proposing to retain a small portion of the act relating to the regulation of barley imports, sparked a particularly lengthy debate. Imagine the clash of opinions, the back-and-forth arguments, the impassioned pleas, the subtle maneuvering for advantage. Supporters of the amendment argued that it was necessary to protect domestic barley producers from foreign competition. Imagine their voices, earnest and insistent, emphasizing the importance of supporting local farmers, of maintaining self-sufficiency, of safeguarding national interests. Opponents countered that the amendment would undermine the principle of free trade and create unnecessary complexities. Imagine their counterarguments, their appeals to economic principles, their warnings of the dangers of protectionism, their insistence on the benefits of open markets. The debate over the barley amendment continued for several hours, with each side presenting evidence, citing statistics, and quoting experts. Imagine the rustling of papers, the consultation of charts and graphs, the presentation of economic data. Finally, after much deliberation, the amendment was put to a vote and narrowly defeated. Imagine the sigh of relief from one side, the muttered disappointment from the other, the sense of a battle won, a battle lost. The committee stage, a slow and painstaking process, eventually came to an end. Imagine the members gathering their papers, stretching their stiff limbs, preparing to return to the main chamber. The bill, now amended and revised, was ready for its third reading. Imagine the document, its pages filled with handwritten amendments, crossings out and insertions, a testament to the meticulous work of the committee. The third reading, a formality, would be followed by a final vote in the House of Commons. Imagine the anticipation building, the sense of approaching culmination, the awareness that the fate of the 1724 Grain Act now hung in the balance. The long and winding road, though nearing its end, still had a few twists and turns remaining. Imagine the path stretching ahead, the final steps to be taken, the destination almost within reach. The air in the House of Commons, usually thick with anticipation and the murmur of hushed conversations, held a peculiar stillness. Imagine the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The members, their faces etched with the fatigue of late nights and long debates, filed back into the chamber, taking their seats on the worn leather benches. The speaker, his wig perfectly aligned, called the House to order. His voice, a low rumble that echoed through the room. Imagine the rustle of papers as the amended bill was placed before him, its pages now bearing the marks of the committee's meticulous work, the crossings out, the insertions, the handwritten amendments in the margins. The clerk, his voice a monotonous drone, began to read the bill for the third time. Imagine the words echoing through the chamber, each clause, each subclause, each meticulously crafted phrase, recited in a flat, uninflected tone. The members, though weary, listened attentively, their eyes scanning the text, ensuring that the amended version accurately reflected the decisions made in committee. Imagine the slow turning of pages, the rustling of silk as they shifted in their seats, the occasional cough breaking the silence. The third reading proceeded at a glacial pace, each sentence, each paragraph, each page meticulously enunciated by the clerk. Imagine the clock on the wall ticking slowly, each tick marking the passage of time, the relentless march towards the inevitable conclusion. The sunlight shifted, casting long shadows across the floor, the dust motes still dancing in the beams of light. The air in the chamber grew heavy, the silence punctuated only by the clerk's droning voice and the occasional creak of the wooden benches. Imagine the faint scratching of a quill pen as one member made a final note in the margin of his copy of the bill. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the clerk reached the end of the document. Imagine the quiet sigh of relief that rippled through the chamber, the subtle shift in posture as the members straightened in their seats. The speaker, his voice regaining a hint of animation, called for the final vote. Imagine the hush that descended upon the room, the sense of anticipation hanging in the air. The question was put, that the bill be now read a third time. Imagine the members rising to their feet, some with alacrity, others with a weary resignation. The ayes and noes were called, the voices echoing through the chamber, a chorus of assent and dissent. Imagine the tellers counting the votes, their fingers moving slowly across the list of names, their voices low and precise. The result was announced. The bill to repeal the 1724 Grain Act had passed. Imagine the ripple of reaction that spread through the chamber, the muted murmurs of satisfaction, the occasional whispered congratulations. There were no cheers, no outbursts of celebration, just a quiet acknowledgement that a long and arduous process had finally come to an end. Imagine the speaker striking his gavel, the sharp crack echoing through the chamber, signaling the end of the debate, the conclusion of the matter. The 1724 Grain Act, after decades of regulating the grain trade, was no more. Imagine the sense of finality, the closing of a chapter, the turning of a page. The members began to file out of the chamber, their footsteps echoing on the stone floor. Imagine the conversations resuming, the voices now louder, the tension released. The sunlight, now fading, cast long shadows across the empty benches. Imagine the dust motes settling, the air still and quiet. The bill, now an act of parliament, would be sent to the king for royal assent, a formality that would mark its official entry into law. Imagine the document, its pages filled with amendments and revisions, making its way to the palace, carried by a messenger through the bustling streets of London. The king's signature, a flourish of quill on parchment, would be the final step, the ultimate confirmation of the act's repeal. Imagine the ink drying, the seal affixed, the document placed in the archives, a testament to the slow, deliberate workings of the British parliamentary system. The repeal of the 1724 Grain Act, while not a momentous event in the grand sweep of history, was nonetheless a significant development for the merchants, farmers, and consumers whose lives were affected by its provisions. Imagine the ripples spreading outwards, the news reaching the ports, the market towns, the farmsteads, carried by word of mouth, by letter, by newspaper report. The changes, though gradual, would be felt in the prices of grain, in the flow of trade, in the rhythms of daily life. Imagine the subtle shifts in the economic landscape, the adjustments made, the new patterns emerging. The 1724 Grain Act, once a fixture of the legal and economic framework, now relegated to the dusty pages of history books, a footnote in the long and complex story of British agriculture and trade. Imagine the pages turning, the years passing, the memory of the act fading, becoming a dim echo of a bygone era. And so, the 1724 Grain Act faded into the annals of history. Imagine the thick, leather-bound volumes in the archives, their pages brittle with age, the ink faded but still legible. Imagine running your fingers lightly over the embossed lettering on the spine, feeling the texture of the aged leather, the 1724 Grain Act, tucked away amongst countless other acts, statutes, and decrees, a silent testament to a specific moment in time. Imagine the faint scent of dust and old paper rising from the open volume, the whisper of centuries past. Its impact, while not earth-shattering, rippled through the economic fabric of the nation. Imagine the merchants in the bustling port cities, adjusting their ledgers, recalculating their profits and losses. Imagine the scratching of quill pens on parchment, the rustle of paper as they updated their records. Imagine the flickering candlelight illuminating their faces, their expressions focused, intent on the details of their trade. The repeal meant a shift in the dynamics of supply and demand, a recalibration of the market forces that govern the price of grain. Imagine the flow of goods changing direction, new routes opening, old ones closing. Imagine the ships setting sail, their canvas sails billowing in the wind, carrying grain to new markets. The farmers, too, felt the effects, albeit gradually. Imagine the fields of golden wheat swaying gently in the breeze, the farmers surveying their crops with a practiced eye. Imagine the sun beating down on their backs, the sweat beading on their foreheads. They adjusted their planting schedules, experimented with new crops, and slowly adapted to the changing market conditions. Imagine the conversations in the village pubs, the farmers discussing the latest prices, sharing tips and advice. Imagine the clinking of tankards, the murmur of voices, the smell of ale and pipe tobacco. The consumers, the vast majority of the population, experienced the change in the most fundamental way, the price of bread. Imagine the bakeries, their ovens radiating warmth, the smell of freshly baked bread filling the air. Imagine the loaves cooling on wooden racks, their crusts golden brown, their interiors soft and airy. Imagine the queues forming outside the bakery doors, the housewives clutching their coins, eager to purchase the staple of their diet. A subtle shift in the cost of a loaf, a penny here or there, could make a significant difference to a family's budget. Imagine the conversations around the kitchen table, the discussions about the cost of living, the careful budgeting of household expenses. Imagine the children eagerly awaiting their slice of bread, their faces smeared with jam. Historians, looking back on this period, view the 1724 Grain Act and its repeal as a small piece of a larger puzzle. Imagine the historians poring over dusty documents, their eyes scanning the faded ink, searching for clues, for connections, for patterns. Imagine the stacks of books surrounding them, the walls lined with shelves filled with volumes of historical records. Imagine the quiet hum of the library, the occasional rustle of pages, the click of a computer mouse. It represents a subtle shift in economic policy, a move away from strict regulation towards a more laissez-faire approach. Imagine the debates in academic circles, the conferences and symposia, the scholarly articles dissecting the nuances of economic history. Imagine the graphs and charts, the statistical analyses, the complex equations used to model economic trends. The Act itself, with its intricate clauses and subclauses, its specific regulations and exemptions, is not a subject of intense scholarly scrutiny. Imagine the footnotes in history books, the brief mentions in academic papers, the passing references in lectures. It's a detail, a nuance, a footnote in the broader narrative of British economic history. Imagine the vast tapestry of historical events, the interwoven threads of political, social, and economic change. The 1724 Grain Act, a single thread, almost invisible in the grand scheme of things. Yet, like all historical events, no matter how seemingly insignificant, it played a role in shaping the world we live in today. Imagine the ripple effect of historical events, the chain reactions that lead from one moment to the next, shaping the course of history. Imagine the interconnectedness of past, present, and future. It contributed to the ongoing evolution of economic thought, the development of market mechanisms, and the complex relationship between government and commerce. Imagine the evolution of ideas, the gradual shift in perspectives, the constant interplay of theory and practice. Imagine the ongoing conversation between past and present, the lessons learned, the wisdom gained. The 1724 Grain Act, a small piece of a much larger story, a whisper from the past that continues to resonate in the present. Imagine the silence of the archives, the stillness of the air, the weight of history resting upon the dusty pages. Imagine the dusty shelves of the archives, filled with volumes detailing the minutiae of British economic history, Imagine running your fingers along the spines, the leather cool and dry beneath your fingertips. The 1724 Grain Act, as we've seen, a seemingly insignificant thread in this vast tapestry, becomes even more obscure when viewed in the context of subsequent legislation. Imagine pulling down a heavy volume detailing the Corn Laws of the early 19th century. Feel the weight of the book in your hands, the slight creak of the binding as you open it. The Corn Laws, a series of acts spanning decades, represent a much more complex and impactful intervention in the grain trade than the 1724 Act. Imagine the densely packed pages filled with legal jargon, the intricate details of tariffs and quotas, the complex mechanisms designed to regulate the import and export of grain. These laws, driven by the interests of landowners, aimed to protect domestic grain production by imposing tariffs on imported grain. Imagine the debates in Parliament, the impassioned speeches, the clash of competing interests. Imagine the newspaper articles, the pamphlets, the public outcry as the price of bread fluctuated. The sheer volume of documentation surrounding the Corn Laws dwarfs the scant records of the 1724 Act. Imagine stacks of parliamentary reports, boxes overflowing with correspondence, shelves groaning under the weight of economic treatises. The Corn Laws, unlike the relatively simple mechanisms of the 1724 Act, employed a sliding scale of tariffs. Imagine a chart, meticulously drawn, plotting the relationship between the price of grain and the level of import duty. As the domestic price of grain fell, the tariffs on imported grain rose, protecting domestic producers from foreign competition. Imagine the merchants poring over these charts, calculating the optimal time to import grain, balancing the cost of tariffs against the potential profits. Imagine the scratching of quill pens on paper, the rustle of ledgers, the murmur of calculations. This complex system, though designed to stabilize the grain market, often led to unpredictable price fluctuations and contributed to social unrest. Imagine the bread riots, the hungry crowds protesting the high cost of food, the clash between protesters and authorities. Later in the 19th century, the repeal of the Corn Laws marked a significant shift towards free trade. Imagine the celebratory speeches, the sense of triumph among free trade advocates, the predictions of economic prosperity. The debates surrounding the repeal were far more intense and widespread than any discussion surrounding the 1724 Act. Imagine the packed galleries in the House of Commons, the hushed anticipation as the votes were tallied, the eruption of cheers as the repeal was announced. This historic event, a watershed moment in British economic history, underscores the relative insignificance of the earlier 1724 Act. Imagine history textbooks highlighting this pivotal moment, the bold typeface emphasizing the repeal's importance, the detailed analyses of its long-term consequences. Even more nuanced approaches to grain regulation emerged in the 20th century, with the introduction of government subsidies and price supports. Imagine government officials meticulously calculating subsidy levels, economists debating the optimal balance between market forces and government intervention. Imagine farmers filling out forms, meticulously documenting their yields and expenses, ensuring compliance with complex regulations. These sophisticated mechanisms, designed to manage agricultural production and ensure food security, bear little resemblance to the rudimentary measures of the 1724 Act. Imagine the flowcharts depicting the complex bureaucratic processes, the computer programs used to monitor agricultural markets, the satellite images used to monitor crop yields. The 1724 Act, with its focus on local market regulation and its limited scope, pales in comparison to the comprehensive and complex systems that followed. Imagine a museum exhibit, a dimly lit room showcasing artifacts from different eras of agricultural policy. A small, dusty ledger representing the 1724 Act sits in a corner, overshadowed by a large, interactive display detailing the intricacies of 20th century agricultural subsidies. The evolution of grain regulation, from the simple to the complex, reflects the broader trend of increasing government intervention in the economy. Imagine the expanding role of government, the growing bureaucracy, the increasing complexity of economic policy. The 1724 Grain Act, a small, almost forgotten step in this long journey. Imagine the dust motes dancing in the beam of a flashlight, illuminating the forgotten corners of the archives, revealing the faint traces of the past. The dust settles on the forgotten ledger. Imagine running your finger along its spine, feeling the texture of aged leather, the slight give of the binding. The 1724 Grain Act, a whisper in the annals of history. Imagine holding that ledger in your hands, its weight a tangible reminder of the passage of time. The paper, brittle and yellowed, whispers of forgotten debates, of concerns long since resolved. Imagine the faint scent of old paper, a dry, earthy aroma that speaks of age and decay. The ink, faded and brown, barely legible in places, testifies to the ephemeral nature of human endeavors. And now, as we approach the conclusion of our exploration of this rather unremarkable piece of legislation, let us recap one final time the key provisions of the 1724 Grain Act. Imagine a dimly lit room, a single lamp casting a warm glow on a table piled high with documents. The air is still, the only sound the gentle rustling of paper as you turn the pages. 1724 Grain Act, as we have seen, primarily concerned itself with the regulation of grain prices in times of scarcity. Imagine the farmers, anxious about the harvest, watching the skies for rain, praying for a bountiful crop. Imagine the townspeople, dependent on the harvest for their sustenance, their livelihoods hanging in the balance. The Act, in its essence, sought to prevent the artificial inflation of grain prices by unscrupulous merchants. Imagine the bustling marketplace, the cries of vendors hawking their wares, the clinking of coins. Imagine the whispers of backroom deals, the furtive glances, the clandestine agreements to manipulate the market. The Act stipulated that grain prices should be determined by the prevailing market conditions, not by the machinations of a few. Imagine the town crier, ringing his bell, announcing the official grain prices for the week. Imagine the sighs of relief from the townspeople, reassured that they would not be exploited. Furthermore, the Act sought to facilitate the free flow of grain between different regions of the country. Imagine the creaking wagons laden with sacks of grain, slowly making their way along dusty roads. Imagine the horses, their breath steaming in the cool morning air, pulling their heavy loads towards distant markets. The Act aimed to prevent local authorities from imposing restrictions on the movement of grain, ensuring that areas of surplus could supply areas of need. Imagine the maps, meticulously drawn, charting the flow of grain across the country, highlighting the interconnectedness of the regions. Imagine the lines connecting towns and cities, representing the routes taken by the grain wagons, the lifelines that sustain the population. The Act also addressed the issue of grain storage, seeking to prevent hoarding and speculation. Imagine the vast granaries filled to the brim with sacks of grain, the air thick with the scent of wheat and barley. Imagine the meticulous record-keeping, the careful tallying of every bushel, the constant vigilance against spoilage and theft. The Act mandated that grain stores be regularly inspected to ensure that they were being maintained properly and that no one was artificially restricting supply to drive up prices. Imagine the inspectors, their clipboards in hand, meticulously checking the quality of the grain, ensuring that it was fit for consumption. While the 1724 Grain Act may seem insignificant in the grand sweep of history, it nevertheless represents a small step towards a more regulated and equitable market. Imagine the slow, incremental progress of legislation, the gradual evolution of laws and regulations, the constant striving for a more just and prosperous society. The Act, in its own small way, contributed to the stability and prosperity of 18th century Britain. Imagine the bustling ports, the ships laden with goods from distant lands, the thriving commerce that fueled the nation's growth. And so, as we draw to a close, let us remember the 1724 Grain Act, not for its dramatic impact or its far-reaching consequences, but rather for its quiet contribution to the everyday lives of ordinary people. Imagine the families gathered around their tables, sharing a simple meal of bread and cheese, their sustenance secured by the workings of the market, regulated by the provisions of the Act. Imagine the warmth of the fire, the flickering candlelight, the sense of peace and contentment that settled over the household. The 1724 Grain Act, a small, almost forgotten piece of the puzzle, yet an integral part of the larger picture. Imagine the puzzle pieces, each one unique, each one essential to the completion of the whole. The 1724 Grain Act, a small piece, perhaps, but a piece nonetheless. And now, as your eyelids grow heavy and your thoughts begin to drift, let the image of that dusty ledger fade into the background, replaced by the gentle embrace of sleep. And now, for the grand finale, as promised, a complete and unexpurgated recitation of the 1724 Grain Act. Settle in, dear listener, let your mind relax, and allow the soothing cadence of legal jargon to wash over you like a gentle tide. Imagine the parchment, aged and brittle, the ink faded but still legible, the words etched into the very fabric of history. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the words transport you to a quieter, simpler time. An act for preventing the enhancing the price of corn and regulating the bounty payable on the exportation thereof. Hear the rustle of the parchment as we turn the page. Feel the weight of history in your hands. Whereas the exportation of corn and grain, when the price or value thereof is at a low rate in this kingdom, tends greatly to the encouragement of tillage. And whereas the present bounty allowed by law on the exportation of corn or grain, ceasing so soon as the prices exceed certain rates, hath been found by experience to be a great discouragement to the raising larger crops, and a disadvantage to the trade of this kingdom. The words flow, a steady stream of clauses and subclauses, a testament to the meticulousness of 18th century legal draftsmanship. Each word, carefully chosen, precisely placed, contributes to the overall effect, an effect designed to soothe and tranquilize. Be it therefore enacted by the King's most excellent majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Lords spiritual and temporal and commons in this present Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same, that the language, formal and archaic, yet strangely comforting in its predictability, the rhythm of the sentences lulling you into a state of deep relaxation, from and after the 24th day of June, 1724, when the price of wheat at the port or place from whence the same shall be exported shall not exceed 32 shillings per quarter, rye 28 shillings per quarter, barley 20 shillings per quarter, malt 24 shillings per quarter, peas and beans 20 shillings per quarter, there shall be allowed and paid upon the exportation thereof a bounty, as follows, viz., for every quarter of wheat 5 shillings, for every quarter of rye 3 shillings and 6 pence, for every quarter of barley 2 shillings and 6 pence, for every quarter of malt 2 shillings and 6 pence, for every quarter of peas and beans 2 shillings and 6 pence, for every quarter of oats 2 shillings. The specific amounts, the shillings and pence, a tangible reminder of a bygone era, the details so precise, so concrete, yet so utterly irrelevant to the present moment. Let them wash over you, a soothing balm to your weary mind. And be it further enacted by the authority aforesaid, that the repetition of phrases, the echoing of legal terminology, creates a hypnotic effect, drawing you deeper and deeper into a state of tranquil drowsiness. For encouraging and regulating the importation of corn and grain into this kingdom from any parts beyond the seas, that when the several sorts of corn or grain before mentioned shall be at the prices following at the several ports or places where the same shall be imported, that is to say, wheat at 56 shillings per quarter, rye at 40 shillings per quarter, barley at 32 shillings per quarter, oats at 24 shillings per quarter, peas at 40 shillings per quarter, beans at 32 shillings per quarter, then, and in every such case, until the several prices respectively above mentioned shall be under the respective prices above limited, the enumeration of grains, the recitation of prices, the intricate web of regulations, all conspire to create a sense of overwhelming monotony, a perfect backdrop for a peaceful descent into slumber. There shall be paid to Her Majesty, her heirs or successors, the several and respective rates and duties of importation, payable upon corn and grain imported into this kingdom from parts beyond the seas, according to the several Acts of Parliament now in force for that purpose. The final clauses, the concluding remarks, the formal pronouncements, all signal the end of our journey. The 1724 Grain Act, laid bare in all its tedious glory, has served its purpose. And be it further enacted that this act shall continue and be in force from and after the said 24th day of June, 1724, for the term of 5 years, and from thence to the end of the then next session of Parliament, and no longer. The last words fade, the echo of history slowly dissipates, leaving behind only the quiet stillness of the night. Breathe deeply, relax your muscles, let your mind go blank. The 1724 Grain Act has lulled you to sleep.